It happened 2 days ago. After years of using Airbnb with nothing but positive experiences, I finally hit a bad one. I'd always heard stories of people booking accommodations that turned out to be disasters, but I never thought I'd be one of them. For the most part, I'd trusted the reviews, the polished photos, and the ease of communication with hosts. This time, though, something went wrong. Really wrong. I found the listing after scrolling through countless options. It was advertised as a charming and cozy full apartment, with bright, inviting photos. The living room had tasteful furniture, the kitchen looked modern, and the bedroom had a big, comfy-looking bed with fluffy pillows. It was perfect for my quick one-night stay. The price, €60, was decent too. Nothing in the listing raised any alarms. So, I booked it without hesitation. For a while, everything seemed normal. The booking was confirmed, and I sent a message to the host introducing myself and asking for instructions to access the property. Days went by without a reply. 2 days before my trip, I still hadn't received any information. I messaged her again, politely asking for the details. Her response came late that night. It was vague. "It's all right," she wrote. "You'll get all the details once you get here." I should have canceled right then. Something about her reply didn't sit right with me, but I rationalized it. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she didn't want to overwhelm me with details I didn't need yet. I convinced myself everything would be fine. After all, I'd never had a bad experience before. Why would this be any different? The day of my trip arrived, and I still hadn't received clear instructions. I messaged her again during my train ride, asking for the address and any check-in details. She responded an hour later with a pin on a map. No address, no explanation, just a pin dropped in the middle of a residential area on the outskirts of town. My stomach tightened, but I told myself I was overthinking it. When I finally got there, I was greeted by a woman in her late 40s. Her appearance was unkempt, messy hair, worn clothes, and she had a peculiar way about her, as if she couldn't care less that I was standing at her door. Without much of a welcome, she ushered me inside. It was immediately clear this wasn't the apartment I had booked. She led me down a dim, narrow hallway that smelled faintly of dampness and mildew. The walls were chipped, the floor creaked underfoot, and the air was cold enough to see my breath. We reached a small bedroom at the end of the hall, and she gestured for me to enter. "This is it," she said. The room was tiny, barely enough space for a single bed and a small table shoved into the corner. The bed was unmade, with a thin blanket and a flat pillow. The window faced a busy highway, and I could hear the constant roar of passing cars. My suitcase barely fit in the room, and when I tried to set it down, I had to maneuver it around the bed just to keep the door clear. I tried to mask my disappointment. The listing had promised a full apartment. This was a damp, claustrophobic bedroom with no privacy. But it was late, and I was exhausted. I had errands to run that evening, and I was leaving early the next morning. I figured I could tough it out for one night. As the woman left me to settle in, I started to notice more problems. The room smelled faintly of cat urine, and the walls were paper-thin. I could hear muffled conversations from the adjacent rooms and the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. The heater in the corner of the room was ancient and barely functioning. I cranked it up to its highest setting, but it emitted nothing but a weak, lukewarm breeze. When I ventured out to use the bathroom, things only got worse. The shared shower was grimy and cluttered with the host's personal items. Half-empty shampoo bottles, used razors, and a bar of soap that had seen better days. I was given a single hand towel to use, which looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. I returned to the room, pulled the blanket off the bed, and folded it in half to create more layers of warmth. It didn't help. The cold seeped through the mattress, and the noise from the highway outside was relentless. Every few seconds, a car or truck would roar past, making the thin window pane rattle. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The combination of the freezing temperature, the noise, and the uncomfortable bed kept me tossing and turning all night. At one point, I even considered lying directly on the floor, hoping it might be warmer than the icy mattress. It wasn't. I wrapped myself in my coat and curled into a ball, desperately trying to generate some warmth. Hours passed. Every minute felt like an eternity. I kept glancing at my phone, counting down the hours until morning. At 5 a.m., I gave up. I packed my things, left the key on the table, and quietly slipped out of the house. The cold air outside felt oddly refreshing after the night I'd endured. I walked to the nearest cafe, ordered a steaming cup of coffee, and sat there for an hour, just letting the warmth seep into me. The experience taught me a hard lesson about trusting appearances. No matter how polished a listing looks or how good the reviews seem, it's always a gamble. I reported the host to Airbnb and left an honest review, warning others about the misleading listing and poor conditions. In hindsight, I should have trusted my instincts the moment things felt off. But sometimes, it takes a bad experience to truly appreciate the good ones. I'll still use Airbnb in the future, but I'll be far more cautious. This was a mistake I won't repeat. It was supposed to be another relaxing trip. I had booked an Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood for the weekend, a chance to escape the chaos of my life for a couple of days. The listing seemed perfect, a cozy little house with great reviews, plenty of privacy, and a price that didn't break the bank. Everything about it felt right. When I arrived, the house was just as charming as the pictures had shown. It was small but welcoming, with a white picket fence, a tidy garden, and soft, warm lighting coming from the windows. The host wasn't around, but she'd left detailed instructions about where to find the key and how to let myself in. Everything went smoothly, and I felt like I'd made a great choice. The house was simple but comfortable. A small living room with a sofa and a bookshelf, a compact kitchen, and a cozy bedroom in the back. It felt like the kind of place where you could curl up with a book and forget the world outside. I unpacked my things, made myself some tea, and settled in for the evening. At first, everything seemed fine. I had dinner, watched a little TV, and read for a while before heading to bed. The bedroom was small but nicely decorated, with a comfortable bed, soft pillows, and a thick blanket. The closet was a sliding door type that ran the length of one wall. It looked like any other closet, unremarkable and probably full of spare linens or old clothes the host didn't use anymore. That night, I started to hear noises. It was subtle at first, a faint creak, like the sound of old wood shifting under pressure. I didn't think much of it. The house was old, and old houses make noises. I told myself it was probably the wind or the foundation settling. But as the night went on, the sounds became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the occasional creak. There were soft, almost imperceptible noises, like rustling or shuffling. They seemed to be coming from the closet. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had pushed something against the wall, or maybe there were mice inside. I turned over, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and tried to fall asleep. But the noise continued, growing louder and more distinct. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and stared at the closet. The room was dimly lit by the glow of a nearby street lamp filtering through the curtains. The closet doors were closed, but I could see the faint outline of the sliding panels. My imagination started running wild. What if there was someone in there? I tried to shake the thought away, but the noise didn't stop. It was steady now, a soft scraping sound that sent chills down my spine. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was no way anyone could be in there. I hadn't seen anything suspicious when I arrived, and the house had felt completely normal. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Taking a deep breath, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I crept toward the closet, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. When I reached the closet, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the edge of the sliding door, trembling slightly. Part of me wanted to open it and get it over with, but another part of me wanted to run back to bed and pretend I'd heard nothing. Finally, I grabbed the handle and slid the door open. What I saw made my blood run cold. Crouched inside the closet, barely visible in the dim light, was a man. He was pressed into the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking. He didn't say a word. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain was struggling to process what I was seeing. Who was he? How did he get in? What did he want? Then, without warning, he bolted. He lunged out of the closet, knocking me to the side as he darted past me. I stumbled and fell, hitting the floor hard. By the time I scrambled to my feet, he was gone. I heard the front door slam and the sound of footsteps fading into the night. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing. Who was that man? How long had he been in the closet? Had he been watching me the whole time I was in the house? I locked the front door, double-checked all the windows, and called the police. They arrived about 20 minutes later. I explained everything as best as I could, though I was still in shock. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but didn't find him. When they asked the host about it, she seemed genuinely surprised. She told them she didn't know anyone who matched the description I gave, and insisted she'd never had any issues with the property before. But then she admitted something that made my stomach drop. She'd recently gone through a messy breakup with her boyfriend and had changed the locks just a few weeks earlier. It turned out he hadn't returned the spare key. The thought of him hiding in the closet, watching me as I went about my evening, still haunts me. I can't stop wondering what might have happened if I hadn't opened the closet when I did. Would he have stayed there all night? Or was he planning something worse? The police advised me to leave the property immediately, and I did. I checked into a hotel for the remainder of my trip and reported the incident to Airbnb. They refunded my stay and promised to investigate the host further, but the whole experience left me shaken. Since then, I've been much more cautious about where I stay and who I rent from. I always check reviews thoroughly, and I make sure to inspect every inch of the place when I arrive. But no matter how careful I am, I can't shake the memory of that man's face in the closet, his wide, unblinking eyes staring back at me in the dark. It started as a regular weekend getaway. I had been looking forward to a quiet break in the city, just some time to myself to explore, relax, and recharge. I found an Airbnb listing for a modern studio apartment in the heart of downtown. The photos looked perfect: clean lines, stylish decor, and a small balcony overlooking the bustling streets below. The host had great reviews. People wrote that she was friendly, responsive, and helpful. It all seemed legitimate. The price was fair, too, neither too cheap to be suspicious nor expensive enough to feel like I was splurging. I booked it without hesitation. When I arrived, the apartment looked just like the photos. It was a bright, airy space with sleek furniture and lots of natural light. The bed was neatly made, the countertops were spotless, and there was even a little welcome basket with snacks and bottled water. The host had left a handwritten note on the table, wishing me a pleasant stay and providing her number in case I needed anything. I spent the first day settling in and exploring the city. I visited a few local shops, grabbed coffee at a cute little cafe, and walked along the river. By the time I got back to the apartment that evening, I was tired but content. I ordered takeout, watched some TV, and then got ready for bed. The first night was uneventful. The bed was comfortable, the neighborhood was quiet, and I slept soundly. It wasn't until the next evening that things started to feel off. I was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something strange. The TV stand in front of me had a small decorative vase on one side and some books stacked neatly on the other. But tucked between the books, barely noticeable, was a small black object. At first, I thought it was just a piece of decor, maybe a Bluetooth speaker or some kind of smart device. But something about it caught my attention. I leaned in closer to get a better look and realized it was a camera. It was small, no bigger than a matchbox, with a tiny lens pointed directly at the sofa. My stomach dropped. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why was there a camera in the living room? Was it supposed to be there? Had the host mentioned it in the listing, and I just didn't notice? I stood up and started looking around the apartment more closely. I opened drawers, moved cushions, and scanned every corner of the room. That's when I found the second camera, this one hidden inside a smoke detector on the ceiling. Panic started to set in. My heart was racing as I climbed onto a chair to get a closer look. Sure enough, there was a tiny lens embedded in the smoke detector, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. At this point, I was shaking. I grabbed my phone and started searching online to see if hidden cameras were allowed in Airbnb rentals. The answer was a resounding no. Hosts were allowed to have security cameras in public areas, like outside the house or at the front door, but cameras inside private spaces like the bedroom or living room were strictly forbidden. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront the host? Should I call the police? I felt violated and unsafe. Someone had been watching me, possibly the entire time I'd been there. I decided to search the rest of the apartment. My hands were trembling as I checked the bathroom. I scanned the shelves, the corners, and the ceiling. That's when I found the third camera. It was hidden inside a fake plant on the bathroom counter, positioned to face the shower. I froze. My mind was racing. How many more cameras were there? How long had they been recording? I felt exposed, like I was being watched at that very moment. I packed my things as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my suitcase without bothering to fold or organize it. I couldn't stay there another minute. I grabbed my bags, locked the door behind me, and headed straight to a nearby hotel. Once I was safely in the hotel room, I called Airbnb's customer service. The representative was sympathetic and assured me they would investigate the matter immediately. They refunded my booking and offered to cover the cost of my hotel stay. I also reported the incident to the local police. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I never heard much about the investigation after that. I'm not sure if they were able to track down who was behind the cameras or if they were even functional, but the whole experience left me shaken. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea that someone had been watching me without my knowledge or consent was horrifying. Every time I stayed in a new place, I found myself scanning for hidden cameras, even in hotels or friends' houses. Since then, I've learned to be extra cautious when staying in unfamiliar places. I bring a flashlight with me and use it to check for reflective lenses, which can indicate a hidden camera. I also unplug or cover any devices that look suspicious, and I make sure to thoroughly read reviews before booking. The experience taught me a hard lesson about trust and privacy. While most Airbnb hosts are genuine and respectful, there are always exceptions. I'm grateful I discovered the cameras when I did, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in a place where I thought I was safe. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance to clear my mind and recharge. I found a secluded cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect. The listing described it as cozy and private, tucked away in the woods, with no neighbors in sight. The photos showed a charming wooden cabin with a porch, surrounded by towering pine trees. The host, a woman named Sarah, seemed friendly and responsive. Her reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with guests praising her hospitality and how accurate the listing was. It felt like the ideal place to relax and disconnect for a few days. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos. It was small but welcoming, with a warm, rustic vibe. There was a fire pit outside, a hammock strung between two trees, and a small porch with rocking chairs. Inside, it was cozy and clean. The living room had a stone fireplace, a comfortable-looking couch, and a little kitchen with everything I needed. Sarah had left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome. I hope you enjoy your stay. Please let me know if you need anything. Don't forget to lock the doors and windows at night. Sarah." I didn't think much of the note at the time. Locking up at night seemed like common sense, especially in a remote area like this. I unpacked my things, made myself a cup of tea, and settled in to enjoy the peace and quiet. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring the woods around the cabin, taking photos of the scenery, and reading on the porch. It was everything I had hoped for, calm, quiet, and relaxing. That evening, I made dinner and lit a fire in the fireplace. As I sat on the couch, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It felt comforting, like I was finally getting the escape I needed. But as the night wore on, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. Around 10 p.m., I heard faint footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path near the porch. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps sounded heavier, like a person. I froze, my heart pounding. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I turned off the lights and peeked through the window, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest outside was pitch black, and the only light came from the dim glow of the porch lantern. The footsteps stopped, and everything went silent. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening for any other sounds. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe a branch falling. I locked the doors and windows, as Sarah's note had suggested, and went to bed. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the eerie feeling from the night before was almost forgotten. I spent the day hiking and enjoying the fresh air. But that evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, the unease returned. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. It was subtle, a flicker of motion among the trees. I turned my head, but I didn't see anything. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, I was sure I saw something, a dark figure moving between the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. I tried to stay calm. It could have been a hiker or a hunter, though I hadn't seen any trails or signs of other people nearby. Still, the thought of someone lurking in the woods made my skin crawl. I went inside, locked the doors, and drew the curtains. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise, branches creaking, leaves rustling, made my heart race. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps again. This time, they were closer. They sounded like they were right outside the cabin, circling around the porch. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Sarah, but there was no signal. The cabin was too remote for reliable service. I sat there, clutching my phone, listening to the footsteps until they faded away. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, just outside the front door, was a single muddy footprint. It was larger than my own foot, and clearly left by a person. Panic set in. Someone had been outside my cabin in the middle of the night. Maybe they were just passing by, but the thought of them standing on the porch, just a few feet from where I was sleeping, terrified me. I packed my bags and left as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother to clean up or check out properly. I just threw everything into my car and drove away. I called Sarah once I was far enough away to get a signal. I told her what had happened, the footsteps, the figure in the woods, the footprint on the porch. She was quiet for a moment, then she said something that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, that must be him. He used to live there. Sometimes he forgets it's not his anymore." I asked her what she meant, but she didn't say much else. She just apologized and promised to look into it. I reported the incident to Airbnb, but they didn't seem too concerned. They refunded my stay and said they'd investigate the host, but I never heard back about it. To this day, I can't stop thinking about that cabin. Who was the man Sarah mentioned? Why was he still coming around? And what would have happened if I had confronted him? The experience left me shaken and wary. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since, and I doubt I ever will again. The idea of being alone in a stranger's property, with no one around to help if something goes wrong, is too much for me now. I wanted a peaceful weekend in the woods, but I got something else entirely, something I'll never forget. It started as an exciting trip to a small coastal town I'd always wanted to visit. I had booked an Airbnb in a charming old house by the sea. The listing described it as a quaint, historic home with ocean views, and the photos made it look stunning. The house was painted white, with blue shutters, a large porch, and a backyard that stretched out toward the beach. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive. Guests raved about how peaceful it was and how the host, a man named Robert, was kind and attentive. I booked it without hesitation. I imagined myself relaxing on the porch, listening to the waves, and enjoying a little solitude. When I arrived, the house was just as beautiful as I had hoped. It stood at the end of a quiet lane, surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and I could hear the waves crashing in the distance. Robert was there to greet me. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. He showed me around the house, pointing out the kitchen, the cozy living room, and the bedroom upstairs. Everything was clean and well kept, with an old-fashioned charm that made me feel right at home. "Feel free to make yourself comfortable," Robert said as he handed me the keys. "I live nearby, so if you need anything, just call." I thanked him, and he left, leaving me to enjoy the house. The first day was wonderful. I walked along the beach, collected seashells, and watched the sun set over the water. The house was quiet and peaceful, and I felt lucky to have found such a perfect spot. But that night, things took a strange turn. I had just gone to bed when I heard a creaking sound from downstairs. It was faint at first, like the groan of old wood, but it grew louder as I listened. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. It sounded like someone was walking through the house, their footsteps slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it might be Robert. Maybe he had forgotten something and let himself in. But why wouldn't he have knocked or called first? I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and crept to the top of the stairs. The house was dark, but I could see faint moonlight streaming through the windows. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response. I stood there for a moment, listening. The house was silent except for the sound of the waves outside. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was probably just the old house settling. I went back to bed, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I brushed off the incident and tried to enjoy my time. I explored more of the town, had lunch at a little cafe, and spent the afternoon reading on the porch. The sea breeze and warm sun helped me relax, and I almost forgot about the strange noises from the night before. But when night came, the unease returned. I was sitting in the living room, reading, when I heard a soft thud upstairs. It sounded like something had fallen or been knocked over. I froze, gripping my book tightly. The noise was followed by another, a faint scraping sound, like furniture being moved. I set the book down and stood up, my pulse racing. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, the hallway was dark, but I could make out the door to the bedroom I wasn't using. It was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. I pushed the door open, my hands trembling. The room was empty, just as I had left it. The bed was untouched, and the dresser and nightstand were undisturbed. But then I noticed the window. It was open, the curtains swaying in the breeze. I walked over and closed it, latching it securely. Maybe I had forgotten to close it earlier, though I didn't remember opening it in the first place. As I turned to leave the room, I saw something on the floor near the dresser. It was a small, old-fashioned key, rusted and worn. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It didn't look like it belonged to anything in the house, at least nothing I had seen. I placed it on the dresser and went back downstairs, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had crept over me. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going to bed. I told myself it was just to be safe, but the truth was I was scared. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were restless. I woke up several times during the night, my heart racing for no reason. At one point, I thought I heard faint whispering, but when I sat up and listened, the house was silent. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I didn't have a clear explanation for what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. As I packed my things, I noticed the key was missing. I had left it on the dresser in the spare bedroom, but when I went to check, it was gone. I searched the room, even checking under the furniture, but it was nowhere to be found. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. When I returned the keys to Robert, he asked if everything had been okay. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I didn't want to explain what had happened. I wasn't even sure I could. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unfinished. I still don't know what to make of the noises, the open window, or the mysterious key. Maybe it was all in my head, or maybe there was more to that old house than I realized. One thing is certain. I'll never forget the eerie sense of being watched, even when I thought I was alone. It all started as an exciting opportunity for a fresh start. I had just gotten a remote job and decided to take a month-long break from my busy city life. I wanted to work somewhere quieter, surrounded by nature. After a bit of searching on Airbnb, I came across the perfect listing, a small, isolated cottage nestled in the mountains. The photos showed a cozy, rustic home with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and large windows that looked out onto rolling hills and endless trees. The description said it was perfect for writers, artists, or anyone seeking peace and solitude. It sounded ideal for me. The host, a man named Michael, had excellent reviews. Guests praised him for being welcoming and quick to respond to any issues. They also mentioned how the cottage was even better in person than in the photos. I booked it without hesitation. When I arrived, the drive up to the cottage was just as picturesque as I'd imagined. A narrow dirt road wound through dense forests, with patches of sunlight streaming through the trees. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and I couldn't hear a single car or voice, just birds and the rustling of leaves. The cottage itself was beautiful. It sat on a small hill, surrounded by wildflowers and tall grass. A wooden fence ran along the property, and there was a tiny garden in the back. Michael wasn't there to greet me, but he'd left a note on the kitchen counter, welcoming me and providing the Wi-Fi password. He also mentioned that cell service was spotty in the area, but the landline phone in the living room worked if I needed to contact him. I spent the first day unpacking, exploring the cottage, and settling into the routine of working remotely. The inside of the house had a warm, inviting charm. There was a big wooden desk by the window, perfect for my laptop, and a cozy reading nook by the fireplace. That night, after a productive day of work, I made myself dinner and curled up with a book. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the stars were so bright they lit up the night sky. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But things started to feel strange the following evening. I was sitting at the desk, finishing up some work, when I noticed movement outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the tall grass. But when I looked closer, I saw a figure standing near the fence. It was too dark to make out any details, but the shape of a person was unmistakable. They were standing completely still, facing the house. My heart started pounding. I stared at the figure, hoping they would move or wave, or do something to show they were harmless. But they didn't. They just stood there motionless, as if they were watching me. I closed the curtains and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was a neighbor, though Michael's listing had said the nearest house was miles away. Or maybe it was a hiker who'd gotten lost and wandered onto the property. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the doors and went to bed, though I kept the lights on. The next morning, I went outside to check near the fence. The grass was tall and untouched, with no sign that anyone had been there. It made me doubt what I'd seen the night before. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But that night, it happened again. This time, I was in the living room, watching TV. I'd drawn the curtains earlier, but I could still feel a sense of unease, like someone was nearby. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a soft knock on the window. I froze. My stomach churned as I stared at the curtains, waiting for something else to happen. The knock came again, louder this time. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and pulled the curtains aside. There was no one there. I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the yard and toward the fence. Nothing. The grass swayed gently in the wind, and the garden was empty. I told myself it must have been a branch tapping against the window or some other innocent explanation. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next day, I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the figure again. That night, I decided to stay up late and keep the lights on. I thought maybe if someone really was out there, they'd be less likely to approach a well-lit house. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. They were faint at first, crunching on the gravel near the front porch. Then they grew louder, circling around the house. I sat frozen on the couch, gripping my phone. I tried to call Michael, but there was no signal. I thought about using the landline, but who would I call? The police? I didn't even know the address of the cottage. The footsteps stopped, and everything went quiet. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the back door, like someone trying to force it open. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just another loud bang. I grabbed the landline and dialed Michael's number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Hello," he said groggily. "Someone's outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're trying to get in." Michael was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'll be there as soon as I can." He hung up before I could say anything else. I locked myself in the bedroom and waited, clutching the knife and the phone. The banging stopped after a while, but I didn't dare leave the room. About an hour later, I heard a car pull up outside. I peeked out the window and saw Michael stepping out of his truck, holding a flashlight. I ran to the door and let him in. He looked concerned but calm, like this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. I explained what had happened, and he walked around the property, checking the doors and windows. "There's no sign of anyone now," he said when he came back inside. "But I'll stay the night, just in case." I didn't ask him why he was so prepared for this, or why he seemed so unsurprised. I was too tired and scared to care. Michael slept on the couch, and I stayed in the bedroom, but I didn't get much sleep. The next morning, I told him I was leaving. He didn't try to convince me to stay or offer an explanation for what had happened. He just nodded and said, "I understand." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael knew more than he was letting on. Maybe it was just a random trespasser, but something about his reaction made me think otherwise. I never found out who, or what, was outside the cottage that night. But I've never booked a remote Airbnb again, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of those footsteps and the banging on the door still haunts me, a reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide dark secrets. I had always dreamed of taking a long break from my busy urban life. Between my hectic schedule and the endless noise of the city, I felt like I was losing myself. So when I got the chance to work remotely for a month, I knew it was the perfect opportunity to escape. I wanted solitude and a deep connection with nature. After browsing Airbnb for days, I found what seemed like the perfect listing: a small, isolated cottage in the mountains. It was advertised as a place for artists, writers, and those seeking peace. The photos showed a charming little house with wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a view that stretched out to endless green hills. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive. Guests wrote about how serene and inspiring the place was. A few mentioned the host, Michael, as being incredibly kind and helpful. Everything sounded ideal, so I booked it for the entire month without hesitation. The day I arrived, the drive itself was a dream. The road wound through thick forests, sunlight streaming through the leaves. The air smelled crisp and earthy, and there wasn't a single car or house in sight. It felt like stepping into a different world, a quieter, more peaceful one. As I approached the cottage, it looked even more beautiful than the photos. Nestled on a hill, it had a small porch, a charming wooden fence, and a tiny garden filled with wildflowers. The surrounding forest seemed to go on forever. I parked my car and stepped out, taking a deep breath. Michael wasn't there to greet me in person, but he'd left a note on the kitchen counter. It welcomed me warmly, provided the Wi-Fi password, and included a reminder that cell service was unreliable in the area. He also wrote that the landline in the living room worked if I needed to contact him or anyone else. The cottage was everything I'd hoped for. The living room had a cozy couch and a large stone fireplace. The kitchen was small but functional, with wooden cabinets and a charming farmhouse sink. Upstairs, the bedroom had a wide window that offered a stunning view of the hills. There was even a wooden desk by the window where I could set up my laptop and work. The first day was perfect. I spent hours unpacking and settling in, followed by a long walk around the property. The silence was profound, broken only by birdsong and the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, I made myself dinner, curled up on the couch with a book, and listened to the distant sound of the wind. I didn't realize how deeply I'd needed this kind of quiet until that moment. The second night was when I noticed something strange. After a productive day of work, I was sitting at the desk, finishing up some emails. It was already dark outside, and the room was lit by the warm glow of the desk lamp. As I worked, I thought I saw a movement outside the window. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind moving the tall grass. But then I saw it again, a figure standing near the fence at the edge of the yard. My hands froze over the keyboard. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing the house. I tried to tell myself it was probably a neighbor or a hiker who had wandered onto the property. But Michael's listing had specifically mentioned that the nearest house was miles away, and the forest wasn't exactly a popular hiking spot. I stared at the figure for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to move. My heart was racing, my palms damp with sweat. Finally, I stood up and turned off the desk lamp, hoping to get a better look without the glare on the window. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I locked the doors and closed all the curtains, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, a trick of the shadows. After all, I was alone in an unfamiliar place. It was natural to feel a little jumpy. But that explanation didn't stop me from sleeping with the lights on. The next day, I went outside to check near the fence. The grass was tall and undisturbed, with no footprints or signs that anyone had been there. I felt a little foolish for being so spooked the night before. I spent the day exploring the nearby forest and catching up on work. By evening, I was starting to feel more relaxed again. The cottage felt cozy and safe, and I told myself I was just overthinking things. But later that night, as I was watching TV in the living room, I heard a soft knock on the window. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. My stomach dropped. I sat completely still, staring at the curtains that covered the window. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a tree branch or an animal. But it sounded deliberate, like someone tapping with their knuckles. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and walked to the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain aside. There was no one there. I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the yard. Everything looked normal. The garden was empty, the fence was undisturbed, and the tall grass swayed gently in the wind. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I felt uneasy. That night, I decided to stay up late and keep all the lights on. I thought that if someone really was out there, they'd be less likely to approach a brightly lit house. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But then they grew louder, crunching on the gravel near the front porch. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching my phone. The footsteps moved around the house, slow and deliberate. I tried to call Michael, but as expected, there was no cell service. I thought about using the landline, but who would I call? I didn't even know the address of the cottage. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the back door, like someone trying to force it open. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. There was no response, just another loud bang. Panicking, I grabbed the landline and dialed Michael's number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice groggy. "Hello. Someone's outside," I whispered urgently. "They're trying to get in." Michael was silent for a moment, then said, "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'll be there as soon as I can." He hung up before I could say anything else. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the knife and the phone. The banging continued for a few minutes, then stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I sat in the corner of the room, shaking, until I finally heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. Michael arrived about an hour later. He stepped out of his truck, holding a flashlight. When I opened the door, he looked concerned, but not surprised. It was as if he'd been expecting something like this to happen. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. I told him everything that had happened. The figure near the fence, the knocking, the footsteps, and the banging at the door. Michael listened quietly, then walked around the property, checking the doors and windows. "There's no sign of anyone now," he said when he came back inside. "But I'll stay the night, just in case." I didn't ask him why he was so calm or why he seemed so prepared for this. I was too tired and scared to care. Michael slept on the couch, and I stayed in the bedroom, but I didn't get much sleep. Every little sound made my heart race. The next morning, I packed my bags and told Michael I was leaving. He didn't try to convince me to stay or offer an explanation for what had happened. He just nodded and said, "I understand." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael knew more than he was letting on. Maybe it was just a random trespasser, but something about his reaction made me think otherwise. I still don't know who, or what, was outside the cottage that night. But I've never booked a remote Airbnb again, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of those footsteps, the knocking, and the banging on the door still haunts me. A chilling reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide dark secrets. The decision to book a remote Airbnb was one I had been thinking about for months. Life in the city had become suffocating, constant noise, endless crowds, and the daily grind that left me feeling drained. When my company announced we could work remotely for a while, I jumped at the chance to escape. After browsing through dozens of listings, I found what seemed like the perfect place, a small, isolated cottage nestled in the mountains. The photos were like something out of a storybook: wooden beams, a stone fireplace, large windows looking out onto rolling green hills, and not another house in sight. The description was even better: a quiet retreat for artists, writers, and those seeking solitude. The host, Michael, had glowing reviews. Guests called him friendly, helpful, and responsive. Some even mentioned that the cottage was better in real life than in the pictures. It all sounded too good to be true. The drive to the cottage was nothing short of magical. As I left the city behind, the roads became quieter, winding through dense forests and small, sleepy towns. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the property, I felt like I was entering another world. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I rolled down my windows and let the breeze wash over me, relishing the silence. When I finally pulled up to the cottage, it was just as beautiful as the pictures had promised. Perched on a small hill, it looked cozy and inviting. A wooden fence bordered the property, and a wildflower garden added a pop of color to the rustic setting. The surrounding forest stretched out as far as the eye could see, with no other houses in sight. Michael wasn't there to greet me, but he'd left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. It welcomed me to the cottage and included the Wi-Fi password, a few recommendations for local hiking trails, and a reminder that cell service was unreliable in the area. He'd also written that if I needed anything, I could use the landline in the living room to call him directly. The interior of the cottage was just as charming as the outside. The living room had a stone fireplace and a plush couch that looked perfect for curling up with a book. The kitchen was small but functional, with wooden cabinets and a cozy breakfast nook. Upstairs, the bedroom had a large window that framed the hills like a painting. I unpacked, set up my laptop at the desk by the window, and spent the rest of the day exploring the property. I walked along the fence, admired the garden, and even ventured a little way into the forest. By evening, I was feeling completely at peace. That first night, I sat by the fireplace, reading and sipping tea as the wind rustled the trees outside. It was everything I'd hoped for, a break from the chaos of my everyday life. The next evening, I was sitting at the desk finishing some emails. The sun had set, and the room was bathed in the warm glow of the desk lamp. I was focused on my work when a sudden movement outside the window caught my eye. I looked up, expecting to see a deer or some other wildlife. But instead, I saw the silhouette of a person standing near the fence. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The figure was completely still, facing the house. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I stared, it became clear it was definitely a person. My mind raced with questions. Who could it be? Michael had said the nearest house was miles away, and the forest didn't seem like a popular hiking spot. Why would someone be out there at this hour, just standing silently? I debated whether to go outside and confront them, but fear kept me rooted to my chair. Instead, I turned off the desk lamp, hoping to see more clearly without the glare. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night on edge, double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a neighbor passing through, maybe, or a trick of the shadows. But I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The following day, I went outside to inspect the area near the fence. The grass was tall and undisturbed, with no footprints or signs that anyone had been there. It made me question what I'd seen the night before. Maybe it really had been my imagination. The day passed without incident. I focused on my work and tried to enjoy the serenity of the cottage. By evening, I was starting to feel more relaxed again. That night, I decided to watch a movie in the living room. I'd drawn the curtains earlier, but even with them closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see the silhouette again. And then I heard it, a soft knock on the window. My heart skipped a beat. The knock came again, louder this time. I sat frozen on the couch, gripping the blanket I'd wrapped around myself. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an animal? A branch tapping against the glass? Or was it someone? Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and approached the window. My hands were trembling as I pulled the curtain aside. There was no one there. I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the yard. The garden was empty, the fence untouched, the grass swaying gently in the wind. Everything looked normal, yet I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had taken hold of me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every creak and rustle. The next night, I resolved to stay up late and keep all the lights on. I thought that if someone really was lurking around, they'd be less likely to approach a brightly lit house. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But then they grew louder, crunching on the gravel near the front porch. I sat completely still, my pulse racing. The footsteps moved around the house, slow and deliberate, as if whoever it was wanted me to hear them. My phone was useless without cell service, and I didn't know what to do. Should I confront them? Stay hidden? Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the back door, like someone trying to force it open. I jumped up and grabbed the kitchen knife I'd left on the counter earlier. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just another loud bang. Panicking, I ran to the living room and grabbed the landline phone. I dialed Michael's number, my fingers fumbling over the buttons. "Hello," he answered groggily after a few rings. "Michael, someone's outside." I whispered urgently. "They're trying to get in." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Lock the doors and stay inside. I'll be there as soon as I can." He hung up before I could say anything else. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the knife and the phone. The banging continued for a few more minutes, then stopped. The The silence that followed was almost worse. I sat in the corner of the room, listening to the sound of my own breathing and praying for morning to come. It was nearly an hour later when I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked out the window and saw Michael stepping out of his truck, holding a flashlight. When I opened the door, he looked concerned but oddly calm, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I felt anything but okay. I told him about the footsteps, the banging, and the figure I'd seen near the fence. Michael listened quietly, then walked around the property, checking the doors, windows, and yard. "There's no sign of anyone now," he said when he came back inside. "But I'll stay the night, just in case." He didn't offer any explanations for what had happened, and I didn't press him. I was too exhausted and shaken to care. Michael slept on the couch that night, while I stayed in the bedroom. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I packed my bags and told Michael I was leaving. He didn't try to stop me or convince me to stay. He simply nodded and said, "I understand." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael knew more than he was letting on. Maybe it was just a random trespasser, or maybe there was something about the area he hadn't told me. I never found out who, or what, was outside the cottage that night. But the memory of those footsteps and the banging on the door still haunts me, a chilling reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide dark secrets. When I booked an Airbnb for my solo vacation, I wasn't looking for luxury or excitement. I wanted peace. After years of putting off vacations, I finally carved out a long weekend to unwind and recharge. I chose a quaint house in a small coastal town far from the bustle of my city life. The listing promised charm, tranquility, and proximity to the beach, a perfect getaway. The host, Claire, had rave reviews. Guests called her warm and accommodating, mentioning how spotless the house was and how she always left thoughtful little touches like fresh flowers or a basket of snacks. The photos showed a cozy, whitewashed cottage with a wraparound porch, bright blue shutters, and a garden that overflowed with lavender and wildflowers. The reviews and pictures were convincing, but what sealed the deal for me was the location. The cottage was tucked away on a quiet road surrounded by trees, with the ocean just a short walk away. It sounded perfect. I arrived on a sunny Friday afternoon, eager to leave behind the chaos of my job and the constant noise of the city. The drive had been long but scenic, taking me through winding roads, past fields of golden wheat, and stretches of sparkling coastline. When I pulled up to the cottage, it was just as picturesque as I'd imagined. The white walls practically glowed in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the faint, salty scent of the sea. There was a handwritten note taped to the front door, welcoming me and telling me where to find the key. Inside, the house was even more charming than I'd expected. The living room had a soft, oversized couch piled with cushions, a well-stocked bookshelf, and a fireplace with a stack of wood ready to use. The kitchen was small but fully equipped, with jars of herbs lining the windowsill and a vase of fresh flowers on the table. Upstairs, the bedroom was bright and airy, with crisp white linens, a bay window that overlooked the garden, and soft rugs that felt luxurious underfoot. It was perfect in every way. I unpacked my things, made myself a cup of tea, and settled into the couch with a book. The quiet was exactly what I'd been craving. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of leaves outside and the occasional chirping of birds. For the first time in months, I felt myself relax. That evening, after a simple dinner, I went for a walk to explore the area. The road outside the cottage was quiet, bordered by tall trees and wildflowers. About 10 minutes down the road, I found a narrow path that led to the beach. The beach was almost deserted, except for a couple walking their dog in the distance. The sand was cool under my feet, and the waves lapped gently against the shore. I stayed until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. By the time I got back to the cottage, it was dark, and the air had turned chilly. I locked the doors, lit a fire in the fireplace, and settled into bed with a sense of contentment. But as I was drifting off to sleep, I thought I heard something. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or the house settling. But then it came again, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the front door. Heart pounding, I crept downstairs, my phone clutched in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, my eyes fixed on the front door. The scratching stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the noise to return. But the house was silent. Finally, I convinced myself it had been nothing, a branch scraping against the door or an animal outside. I double-checked that the door was locked, then went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, but determined to shake off the unease from the night before. I spent the day exploring the little town nearby, browsing its tiny shops and enjoying a long lunch at a cafe by the water. By the time I returned to the cottage, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden. I noticed something odd as I walked up to the front door. Faint marks on the wood, near the bottom of the doorframe. They looked like scratches, though I couldn't be sure. I bent down for a closer look, but the fading light made it hard to see. Dismissing it as wear and tear, I unlocked the door and went inside. That evening, I built another fire and curled up on the couch with a movie. The cozy atmosphere helped me relax, and for a while, I felt like I was in my own little sanctuary. But as the hours passed, the unease I'd felt the night before started creeping back. The house was too quiet, and every little creak or rustle set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, just as I was about to head upstairs to bed, I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was louder and more insistent. I froze, my eyes darting to the front door. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. Gripping my flashlight, I slowly approached the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might drown out the sound. "Hello." I called out, my voice shaking. The scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a soft thud came from the other side of the door, as if something heavy had been dropped. Fear prickled at the back of my neck. I wanted to fling the door open and see what was out there, but the rational part of me screamed to stay inside. I backed away, double-checking that the door was locked, and ran upstairs to the bedroom. I locked the door behind me, grabbed my phone, and tried to call Claire. No service. I stared at the screen in frustration, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Who could I call? I sat on the bed, clutching my phone and the flashlight, listening intently. The scratching didn't come back, but the night felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The next morning, I found more scratches on the front door, long, deep gouges that hadn't been there the day before. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog, but the logical part of me knew better. The marks were too deliberate, too precise. I called Claire from the cottage's landline and told her what had been happening. She sounded surprised and concerned, apologizing profusely and promising to drive over to check on me. While I waited for her to arrive, I tried to stay busy. I cleaned the kitchen, tidied up the living room, and even went for a short walk down the road. But the scratches on the door were always at the back of my mind. Claire arrived in the early afternoon, her face lined with worry. She inspected the scratches and seemed genuinely baffled. "This has never happened before," she said, shaking her head. "I've had dozens of guests here, and no one's ever mentioned anything like this." She offered to stay the night to make sure I felt safe, but I assured her I'd be fine. I didn't want to inconvenience her, and honestly, part of me felt silly for being so rattled. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to get some rest before heading back home the next morning. I locked all the doors and windows, checked every room, and even left the hallway light on. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to relax. But as the hours ticked by, my unease grew. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of banging. It was loud and forceful, shaking the walls of the cottage. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The noise was coming from the front door, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching. This time, it was relentless. Gripping my flashlight, I crept to the bedroom window and peered outside. The porch light cast a dim glow, but I couldn't see anyone or anything near the door. I wanted to run, to get in my car and drive as far away as possible. But the thought of opening the door, even for a second, filled me with dread. The banging and scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed awake until dawn, my body tense and my mind racing. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. I never found out what had been outside the cottage that weekend. Claire called me a few days later to apologize again, but she had no answers either. She'd checked the property thoroughly and found no signs of anyone or anything that could have caused the scratches or banging. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but the memory of those sounds, the deep scratches on the door, and the overwhelming sense of dread still haunts me. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. I've always been a fan of traveling. It was a way for me to escape my everyday life, see new places, and meet new people. When I decided to visit a small town in the countryside, I turned to Airbnb for a place to stay. I was looking for something cozy and peaceful, away from the noise of city life. I found a listing that looked perfect, an old farmhouse surrounded by fields and nature. The pictures showed a lovely rustic home, with a large front porch and a garden full of flowers. The reviews were glowing, and the host, James, seemed very friendly. It felt like the perfect spot for a quiet weekend getaway. I arrived at the farmhouse on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, but the scenery was beautiful, rolling hills, small cottages, and the kind of countryside I had always imagined. As I pulled up to the farmhouse, I felt a sense of peace. The house stood tall against the horizon, surrounded by trees and fields that stretched on for miles. The front porch had a swing, and the garden was full of colorful blooms. It looked exactly like the photos on the listing, if not better. James greeted me at the door with a warm smile. He was an older man, in his late 50s, with a gentle demeanor. He explained the basic details about the house, how to use the fireplace, where to find the towels and sheets, and the best places to visit in the area. Everything about him felt genuine and welcoming. "The house has been in my family for generations," James told me, his voice filled with pride. "It's a bit old, but it's full of character." I smiled and nodded, thinking how lucky I was to have found such a place. I was eager to unwind, so I thanked him for the warm welcome, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The inside of the farmhouse had a charming, rustic feel. The living room had wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. There were old pictures on the walls, some of James and his family, others of the farmhouse through the years. A large wooden dining table sat in the center of the room, and the kitchen, though small, was well equipped with everything I needed. It wasn't the most modern place, but it was cozy and inviting. I chose the bedroom upstairs. The bed was big, with soft sheets and a thick quilt that looked like it had been passed down through generations. I unpacked my things, laid out my clothes for the weekend, and then sat by the window for a while, looking out over the fields. Everything was peaceful. The only sounds I could hear were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. It felt like a dream come true. After unpacking, I decided to explore the area a bit. I walked around the property, taking in the beauty of the countryside. There was a small barn out back, a few sheds, and a long gravel path that led to a nearby forest. Everything about the place felt tranquil, and I could see myself enjoying a few days here. That night, I made a simple dinner in the kitchen, enjoying the quiet atmosphere of the house. It was the kind of place where you could just relax and forget about the rest of the world. After dinner, I sat by the fire, reading a book and sipping tea. It was so quiet that I could hear the crackling of the logs in the fireplace. But then, around 9 p.m., I heard something strange. It was a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the door. I stood up, confused. I hadn't heard anyone approach the house, and James had said he would be busy with other things for the rest of the evening. I checked the door, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside. I went back to my chair by the fire, but then the tapping came again. This time, it was louder. It sounded more like someone trying to get in, but when I looked through the window, there was still no one around. My heart started to race. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just the house settling or the wind, but there was something unsettling about it. The tapping continued for a few more minutes before it stopped altogether. I sat still, listening carefully. The silence that followed felt even more intense. The next day, I tried to forget about the strange knocking. I went into town to explore and grabbed lunch at a small cafe. The day was bright and sunny, and I enjoyed the calm atmosphere. I didn't think about the farmhouse's strange noises at all. But as the sun began to set, I returned to the house, and that nagging feeling returned. It was hard to explain, but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. The house felt a little too quiet, a little too still. I started hearing odd sounds again, footsteps in the hallway, a creaking floorboard, and a faint rustling noise from upstairs. It was as if someone else was in the house, but I was completely alone. I decided to investigate. I checked every room, even the attic, but everything seemed fine. I couldn't find any sign that someone else was there, yet the feeling didn't go away. It was like I was being watched, but no one was there. Later that night, after another quiet dinner, I went to bed, trying to ignore the sense of unease in my chest. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But as I lay in bed, I heard something again, the sound of footsteps, slowly walking down the hallway. My heart raced. I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. There was no one there, I was sure of it. But the sound was real. I could hear it as clearly as I could hear my own heartbeat. After what felt like hours, the footsteps faded away. But I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, my eyes wide open, waiting for whatever would happen next. By the third night, I was exhausted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what. The house felt too still, too quiet, and the odd noises continued, footsteps, tapping, rustling. But there was never anyone to explain them. I started to wonder if the house itself had a history, something James hadn't mentioned. I thought about asking him, but the thought of confronting him made me uneasy. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was overreacting? Around 10 p.m., as I was sitting in the living room, I heard a loud bang from upstairs. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. The sound had come from the bedroom area, and I was suddenly filled with dread. I grabbed my phone and called James, but there was no answer. I tried again and again, but it went straight to voicemail. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, rushed out of the house, and drove into town to a small inn. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to get out of there. I felt like I wasn't alone, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching me. When I checked out the next morning, I tried to text James and explain that I had left, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full story. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. The whole experience felt too surreal. But when I returned home, I couldn't shake the memories of the farmhouse, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, the footsteps that never made sense. When I got back, I did a little research about the farmhouse. To my surprise, I found an old article about a fire that had occurred on the property many years ago, long before James had taken over. The fire had damaged part of the house, and there were rumors that the previous owners had experienced strange things too. Noises, cold spots, and the feeling of someone walking around when no one was there. I wasn't sure if it was just coincidence, but it seemed like the house had a history of odd events. I never did hear back from James after I left, and part of me is relieved I didn't press him for more information. The last thing I wanted was to learn that something darker was lurking in that farmhouse. I've never stayed in an Airbnb in the countryside since. The memories of those nights are enough to make me think twice about booking a secluded place again. It was the summer of 2022, and I had just booked a solo weekend getaway in a small, quiet town nestled deep in New England. I was 28, working a hectic job in the city, and I desperately needed a break. Scrolling through Airbnb, I came across a charming vintage Victorian-style home. Its photos promised antique furniture, creaky wooden floors, and an air of nostalgia that intrigued me. It was perfect, far from the modern, sterile apartments I was used to. The host, a middle-aged woman named Susan, was friendly and responsive, assuring me the house would be all mine as she and her husband were traveling for the weekend. I arrived late Friday afternoon, the warm sun casting a golden glow on the pale blue exterior of the house. The garden was overgrown but endearing, with wildflowers spilling onto the stone path leading to the front door. Inside, the house was even more captivating. A crystal chandelier hung in the foyer, and the walls were lined with old photographs in ornate frames. The air smelled faintly of lavender, mixed with something I couldn't quite place, maybe the mustiness of old wood. After settling in, I wandered through the house, marveling at the intricately carved furniture and the vintage wallpaper that seemed to have stories of its own. The bathroom, tucked away at the end of the second-floor hallway, had a clawfoot tub and a sink with porcelain faucets. The doorknob, like many others in the house, was a brass antique piece that felt slightly loose when I turned it. That evening, I made myself a light dinner in the small but well-equipped kitchen and ate on the front porch, watching the sunset. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was completely alone, and while part of me enjoyed the solitude, another part couldn't shake the feeling that the house held its own secrets. When night fell, I decided to shower and wind down. I carried my phone with me, as I always did, to play some music while I bathed. The bathroom was dimly lit by a single bulb, and the old pipes groaned as hot water spilled into the tub. The sound of Billie Eilish's Ocean Eyes filled the space, a comforting contrast to the house's silence. After my shower, I wrapped myself in a towel and reached for the doorknob. It didn't budge. At first, I thought it was just stuck, so I jiggled it harder. Nothing. A pang of unease crept up my spine. I tried again, this time putting more force into it, but the knob spun loosely without catching. I was trapped. I stood there for a moment, my wet hair dripping onto the tiled floor, trying to rationalize the situation. It was an old house, after all, and the hardware was probably as temperamental as the creaky floors. But as I stared at the door, a darker thought crept into my mind. What if someone had locked me in? What if this was some kind of trap? My heart began to race. I checked my phone, relieved to find I had a strong signal. I hesitated, debating whether to call Susan. It was late, and I didn't want to bother her, but I also didn't want to spend the night locked in a bathroom. Finally, I dialed her number. She answered groggily, clearly woken up by my call, but she was kind and understanding when I explained the situation. She promised to send her co-host, a local handyman named Greg, to help me. While I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The small window in the bathroom faced the backyard, which was completely dark. I imagined shadows moving just beyond my line of sight, though I knew it was likely my imagination. I sat on the edge of the tub, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Greg arrived about 30 minutes later, though it felt like hours. I heard his footsteps on the stairs and the faint sound of tools clinking. He worked on the door from the outside, and after a few tense minutes, it finally swung open. Greg, a burly man in his 50s with a kind face, apologized profusely for the inconvenience. He explained that the doorknobs in the house were notorious for sticking and suggested I keep the bathroom door slightly ajar next time. I thanked him, embarrassed but grateful. After he left, I returned to the bedroom, still on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, even though I knew the incident was purely mechanical. I decided to leave all the lights on, thinking it might make the house feel less daunting. The soft glow from the lamps illuminated every corner, but it also cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls. I crawled into bed, clutching my phone as if it were a talisman. The mattress was old and lumpy, and the sheets smelled faintly of mothballs, but I was too tired to care. I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified in the silence, each one making my heart race. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the curtains, and the house felt completely different. The warmth of the morning light chased away the shadows, and the unease of the previous night seemed almost silly in hindsight. Before leaving that afternoon, I wrote a note to Susan, thanking her for her help and suggesting she look into replacing the doorknobs. As I drove away, the house faded into the distance, and with it, the lingering sense of dread. Looking back, I can't explain why I felt so unsettled that night. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe the old house just had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Either way, it was a weekend I wouldn't forget. It reminded me that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we create in our own heads. It was the summer of 2018. My brother Luis was getting married in a few weeks, and to celebrate, he decided to host his bachelor party somewhere completely out of the ordinary. No crowded bars or bustling cities. Luis wanted something quiet, remote, and disconnected from the chaos of daily life. He rented a cabin deep in the forests of Wyoming, far from civilization. I can't remember the exact name of the place, but I vividly recall how isolated it was. It felt like we had stepped into another world. Luis invited me and 5 of his closest friends, guys he'd grown up with or met during college. All of us were in our mid-20s, full of energy, and ready for a week of hiking, barbecues, and bonding. The cabin itself was beautiful, a rustic 2-story structure with wood paneling, large windows, and a wraparound porch. It sat near a small river, about a 15-minute walk through the trees, and was surrounded by nothing but towering pines and endless wilderness. There wasn't a soul for miles, which felt both exciting and a little unsettling. For the first 3 days, we had the time of our lives. During the day, we hiked through trails that Luis had mapped out, threw a football around in the clearing near the cabin, and grilled burgers and steaks on the porch. At night, we sat around a fire pit, swapping stories and laughing until our sides hurt. It was exactly the kind of break we all needed. The last 2 days took a different turn. By then, the novelty of hiking and being outdoors had worn off, and we leaned hard into drinking. We stocked the cabin with cases of beer and bottles of whiskey, and by the second night of our binge, everyone was hammered. We ended up doing what drunk guys usually do, calling our exes, reminiscing about old times, and making grand plans we'd never follow through on. That night, one by one, we started to pass out. 2 of Luis's friends crashed on the couches in the living room, their snores echoing through the cabin. Luis and the others managed to stumble to the bedrooms on the first floor. Somehow, I made it upstairs to my room on the second floor. I remember collapsing onto the bed, still fully dressed, the room spinning slightly as I drifted off. I woke up around 4 a.m. with a terrible urge to vomit. My stomach churned, and I barely made it to the bathroom before I emptied everything I'd had that night. I leaned against the sink for a while, splashing cold water on my face and trying to steady myself. When I felt like I could walk without stumbling, I shuffled back toward my room. That's when I saw him. I was halfway down the hall, rubbing my eyes and yawning, when something caught my attention. I froze, squinting through the darkness. Down in the living room, a man was standing near the couch where Luis's friends were sleeping. He was tall, maybe my height, with light skin, and he was wearing a plain t-shirt, shorts, and no shoes. What struck me most was the flashlight he was holding. It emitted a dim red light that cast an eerie glow over the room. He moved the beam slowly, almost deliberately, over the 2 guys on the couch. My heart dropped. I knew for a fact that this wasn't one of us. We were all brown Latinos, and there was no way a white guy had suddenly joined our group without anyone noticing. For a moment, I thought maybe I was still drunk, my mind playing tricks on me. I rubbed my eyes again and leaned over the balcony that overlooked the living room, trying to get a clearer view. He was gone. I stared at the spot where he had been, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch dark now, and everything was silent. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, footsteps, a door creaking, anything, but there was nothing. Just the faint snores of Luis's friends and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the wooden railing of the balcony. My phone was downstairs, and I didn't dare go down to get it. Instead, I crept back to my room, closing the door quietly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, my mind racing. Who was that man? How had he gotten into the cabin without anyone hearing him? And why had he been shining a red flashlight on my brother's friends? I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. Every creak of the cabin made my stomach twist, and I kept imagining that man appearing at my door. But the hours dragged on without incident, and eventually, the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. When the others started waking up, I went downstairs, half expecting to find some sign of a break-in, maybe a broken window or a door left ajar. But everything was exactly as we had left it. The front door was locked, the windows were intact, and nothing was out of place. Luis and his friends laughed off my story, insisting it must have been a bad dream or a drunken hallucination. They pointed out that they would have woken up if someone had been in the cabin, especially someone with a flashlight. But I know what I saw. That man was real. His face was blurry in my memory, but I'll never forget the glow of that red flashlight or the way he moved so quietly, almost like a ghost. I still don't understand how he got into the cabin or how he left without making a sound. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and the idea of someone wandering that deep into the woods in just a t-shirt and shorts, with no shoes, still sends chills down my spine. We left the cabin the next day, cutting the trip short. Luis teased me about being paranoid, but I could tell he was a little unsettled too. I haven't been back to Wyoming since, and I doubt I ever will. Sometimes late at night, I think about that man and wonder what he was doing out there, so far from civilization. Was he lost? Curious? Or something else entirely? I'll probably never know. But one thing's for sure. There are some things in this world that defy explanation, and that night in the cabin is one of them. It all started when I planned a solo trip to New Orleans in the spring of 2019. I had always wanted to visit the city. The rich history, the music, the food, and the French Quarter's vibrant energy. It had been on my bucket list for years. So, when I finally got a break from work, I decided to go for it. The Airbnb I booked looked perfect. It was a charming one-bedroom apartment in an old brick building located right in the heart of the French Quarter. The photos showed exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and a small but cozy living room. It even had a tiny balcony overlooking the bustling streets. The host, Greg, had great reviews. People described him as friendly and accommodating, so I didn't think twice about booking. When I arrived, the place was just as beautiful as the photos. Greg had left me a friendly welcome message, apologizing that he wouldn't be around since he worked late-night shifts, but assuring me that I could text him anytime. I was excited to have the apartment to myself. After all, part of the appeal of staying in an Airbnb is that it feels like you're living like a local. My first day in New Orleans was amazing. I spent hours wandering through the French Quarter, eating beignets at Café du Monde, and listening to jazz musicians playing on the streets. By the time I got back to the Airbnb that night, I was exhausted but happy. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, and settled into bed, ready for a good night's sleep. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just the faint creak of a door opening. I froze in bed, my heart suddenly pounding. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted something in the apartment, or I was just hearing noises from the street outside. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing. I knew I had locked that door. Triple-checked it, even. My first thought was that someone had broken in. My second thought, strangely enough, was that maybe Greg had come back for some reason. But why would he come in without telling me? I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and tiptoed to the bedroom door. From there, I could see a sliver of the living room. The apartment was dark, but I could see the front door. It was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if it had just been pushed open. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. No one was there. The streetlights outside cast long shadows into the room, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I couldn't stay where I was. My phone was on the nightstand in the bedroom, but I didn't want to turn back. Instead, I moved toward the door as silently as possible, trying not to make a sound. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I winced. When I reached the door, I pushed it shut, my hand trembling as I slid the lock back into place. Then I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the doorknob, just in case. I stood there for a moment, listening. The apartment was completely silent. I strained my ears, trying to catch any noise, footsteps, breathing, anything, but there was nothing. Slowly, I backed away from the door and returned to the bedroom. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone and staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the old building made me jump, and every shadow seemed to shift in the corner of my eye. When the sun finally came up, I felt a wave of relief. Daylight made everything seem less frightening. I texted Greg, asking him if anyone else had access to the apartment. Maybe he had forgotten to mention something. His response came about an hour later. "Hey, sorry for the late reply. No one else should have access." The door opening thing has happened once before, though. The previous guest said the same thing, but I've never experienced it myself. Probably just the old doorframe or something. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. His words played over and over in my head. The way he brushed it off didn't sit right with me. A door unlocking and opening on its own wasn't normal, no matter how old the building was. And why hadn't he mentioned it in the listing? I didn't say anything else to Greg. Instead, I packed my things, left the apartment, and checked into a hotel down the street. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. Looking back, I still can't explain what happened that night. Maybe the door was faulty, like Greg said, or maybe someone had a key and decided to let themselves in. Either way, I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and got out of there. That trip to New Orleans was unforgettable for many reasons, but that night in the Airbnb is something I'll never forget. To this day, whenever I book a stay, I make sure to read every review carefully and double-check the locks, because you never know what might happen when you're staying in someone else's home. It happened during a work trip to Denver in the spring of 2022. I needed a place to stay for a few nights, and instead of booking a hotel, I decided to try an Airbnb. I wanted somewhere comfortable, something that would feel more like home. I found a listing for a modern one-bedroom apartment. It looked great in the photos, clean, sleek furniture, and a cozy living room. The host, Emily, had glowing reviews. Many guests mentioned how friendly and accommodating she was, so I felt good about my choice. She even left a message when I booked, saying she hoped I'd enjoy my stay. When I arrived, the place was just as nice as it looked in the pictures. Emily had even gone the extra mile to make the stay special. There was a basket of snacks on the kitchen counter and a handwritten welcome note that said, "Enjoy your stay. Let me know if you need anything." The first night went smoothly. I had a long day at work, so I came back to the apartment, made some tea, and relaxed on the couch. The apartment was quiet, and I felt safe. I even told myself I'd leave a nice review for Emily when my stay was over. The second night, however, was when things took a strange turn. After another busy day, I returned to the apartment around 7 p.m., had dinner, and watched a movie. At around 10 p.m., I was lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd. The smoke detector on the ceiling, right above the bed, caught my attention. It wasn't unusual to see a smoke detector, of course, but something about it felt off. The lens on the front seemed to reflect light in a strange way, almost like a camera. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the way the light from the lamp was hitting it. But the more I stared at it, the more uncomfortable I felt. Why was it positioned directly over the bed? I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. So, I decided to check it out. Standing on a chair, I reached up and unscrewed the cover of the smoke detector. My hands were shaking slightly, but I told myself it was probably nothing. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a small camera, neatly hidden behind the cover. I stared at it, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. At that moment, I didn't know what to do. I climbed down from the chair, holding the smoke detector in my hands. My mind raced with questions. Who put this here? Was it Emily? Was someone watching me right now? I quickly packed my things, throwing everything into my suitcase as fast as I could. I didn't even bother folding my clothes. I just wanted to get out of there. Before leaving, I took a photo of the camera inside the smoke detector as proof. Then I grabbed my bag and left the apartment. I sat in my car, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my phone. I called Airbnb's customer support and explained what I had found. The person on the other end sounded concerned and told me they would investigate immediately. They also helped me book a hotel for the night and said I'd be refunded for my stay. The next day, I got a message from Emily. She denied everything, claiming that the camera was for security purposes and that it had never been used to spy on guests. I didn't believe her. Why would a camera be hidden in a smoke detector? And why would it be pointed directly at the bed? A few days later, I received an update from Airbnb. They had removed Emily's listing from the platform and were cooperating with local authorities to investigate further. I later learned that several other guests had reported similar issues with her property. To this day, I can't stop thinking about how long that camera might have been there and what it recorded. The thought of someone invading my privacy like that makes me feel sick. Since that experience, I've been extremely cautious about where I stay. I check every room thoroughly, look for hidden cameras, and make sure to read reviews carefully. Staying in someone else's home is supposed to feel safe, but that trip taught me an important lesson. Not everything is as it seems. It was a trip my husband and I had been looking forward to for months. We both needed a break from the stress of work and life in general. So, when we found an Airbnb listing for a cozy, remote farmhouse in Vermont, we booked it immediately. The photos showed a beautiful old house surrounded by tall trees, with a charming porch and plenty of space to relax. It seemed like the perfect spot for a peaceful getaway. The listing described the farmhouse as rustic but well-maintained, and the reviews were mostly positive. The only thing that caught my attention was a note about an unusable basement. The host, Susan, mentioned that the basement was locked and guests shouldn't try to access it. It seemed like a strange detail, but I brushed it off. After all, it wasn't unusual for Airbnb hosts to use certain areas for personal storage. When we arrived, the place was even prettier than it looked in the photos. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by nothing but forest and open fields. The air was crisp and fresh, and the silence was almost overwhelming after living in a busy city. Susan was there to greet us when we arrived. She was a friendly woman in her 50s with a warm smile and a firm handshake. She gave us a quick tour of the house, pointing out the kitchen, the cozy living room with a stone fireplace, and the upstairs bedrooms. When we got to the basement door, which was located just off the kitchen, she casually mentioned, "This door stays locked." Nothing interesting down there, just some old furniture and tools. I nodded, not thinking much of it, and we continued the tour. Once Susan left, my husband and I unpacked, made dinner, and settled into the living room to enjoy the quiet. It was exactly what we had hoped for, a chance to unwind and escape the noise of everyday life. That first night was uneventful. We slept well, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was surprisingly soothing. The next day, we spent our time exploring the area, hiking along trails, and enjoying the peacefulness of the countryside. Things started to feel strange on our second night. After dinner, we were sitting on the couch, talking about our plans for the next day, when we heard a noise. It was faint at first, like a soft thud, but it was coming from somewhere in the house. We both froze, staring at each other. "What was that?" I whispered. "I don't know," my husband said, his brow furrowing. We sat in silence for a moment, listening. The sound came again, a muffled thump, followed by what sounded like a faint scraping noise. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement door. "Maybe it's the wind," my husband said, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, trying to brush it off. But deep down, I felt uneasy. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the old house set me on edge. Around midnight, I heard the noise again, this time louder and more distinct. It sounded like someone moving around downstairs. I shook my husband awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. We both listened in silence, and there it was again, a faint shuffling sound coming from the direction of the basement. "I'm going to check it out," he said, getting out of bed. "No." I grabbed his arm. "What if it's someone?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's just lock our door and try to sleep. If it keeps happening, we'll leave in the morning." We locked the bedroom door and stayed up for hours listening. The noises continued sporadically, soft thuds, scraping, and even what sounded like a quiet cough. By the time morning came, we were both exhausted. We decided to take a closer look at the basement door before making any decisions. My husband tried the doorknob, but as Susan had said, it was locked. He knocked on the door, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response. We looked around the house for anything unusual, but found nothing. The windows and doors were all intact, with no signs of a break-in. It didn't make sense. I was ready to leave, but my husband convinced me to stay one more night. He suggested that maybe the noises were just the house settling or animals moving around outside. I wasn't so sure, but I agreed to stay. That evening, as we were eating dinner, the noises started again. This time, they were louder and more frequent. It was clear that they were coming from the basement. My husband grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, determined to figure out what was going on. I followed him as he approached the basement door. He knocked again, harder this time. "Whoever's in there, you need to leave," he shouted. Silence. Then, just as he turned away, we heard a single loud bang from behind the door. My heart raced as we both stumbled back, staring at the door. "That's it," I said, grabbing my coat. "We're leaving." We packed our bags as quickly as we could and drove to the nearest hotel. I texted Susan to let her know what had happened, but she didn't respond until the next morning. Her message was vague, simply saying, "I've never had any issues before. Sorry you felt uncomfortable." We left a review mentioning the strange noises and our experience. A few weeks later, I received a message from another guest who had stayed there after us. "Hey, I saw your review and wanted to reach out. We heard the same noises in the basement during our stay. Turns out there was a squatter living down there. The host said she didn't know, but I'm not so sure. Just thought you should know." The message sent chills down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we had stayed longer, or if my husband had managed to open the basement door. That trip taught me to be more cautious about where we stay. The farmhouse was beautiful, but the experience left me shaken. Even now, I sometimes wonder about the person who was hiding down there, who they were, how they got in, and what they wanted. I hope I never have to find out. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. My two best friends, Sarah and Emily, and I had been planning a weekend trip to a small, quiet town in upstate New York for weeks. We all needed a break from our busy schedules and thought this would be the perfect chance to catch up and unwind. After searching through Airbnb, we found the perfect place. A charming 3-bedroom cottage tucked away in the woods. The pictures showed a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a cute kitchen with vintage touches, and a wraparound porch overlooking the forest. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. The host, Diane, had great reviews. People described her as helpful and kind, and everyone mentioned how peaceful and beautiful the cottage was. We booked it without hesitation. When we arrived, the place looked just as lovely as it did in the photos. The driveway was lined with tall pine trees, and the cottage itself was surrounded by a lush green forest. Diane wasn't there to greet us, but she had left a key in a lockbox by the front door, along with a note welcoming us and a list of house rules. The first day was perfect. We spent the afternoon exploring the nearby trails, taking pictures, and enjoying the fresh air. That evening, we cooked dinner in the small kitchen, lit a fire in the fireplace, and sat around laughing and reminiscing about old times. It felt like the peaceful escape we had all been looking for. Later that night, after we had all gone to bed, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The sound was faint, like a soft tapping, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. I lay there in the dark, trying to figure out what it was. Tap, tap. The sound was steady, coming from somewhere near the living room. I sat up in bed and listened. It didn't stop. My heart started to race as I thought about what it could be. Maybe it was just a tree branch tapping against a window, I told myself. But the tapping sounded too rhythmic for that. I got out of bed and tiptoed to my bedroom door. When I opened it, the house was completely silent except for the tapping. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. "Sarah, Emily," I whispered, but there was no response. I walked toward the living room, my bare feet making no noise on the hardwood floor. As I got closer, the tapping grew louder. It was coming from the front door. I stopped a few feet away, staring at the door. Someone, or something, was on the other side. My stomach twisted in fear. I thought about waking Sarah and Emily, but I didn't want to panic them if it turned out to be nothing. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I stared for a moment, confused. The tapping had definitely been coming from the door, but there was no one there. I stayed by the door for a while listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been an animal or something else harmless. The next morning, I told Sarah and Emily about what had happened. They both laughed it off, saying I was probably just imagining things, or that it was a raccoon. I tried to believe them, but something about it didn't sit right with me. That day, we went into town to explore and do some shopping. The town was small, with just a few shops and restaurants, but it had a certain charm. While we were walking through an antique store, I mentioned the tapping noise to the store owner. "Oh, you're staying in the woods?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, in a cottage not far from here," I said. She gave me a strange look. "Well, just be careful. It's quiet out there, and sometimes things happen in those woods." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't press her for details. I didn't want to freak myself out even more. That night, everything felt off. The house, which had seemed so cozy and inviting before, now felt cold and unwelcoming. Even Sarah and Emily noticed it. We tried to distract ourselves by playing card games and watching movies, but the atmosphere felt tense. Around midnight, we all went to bed. I was just starting to drift off when I heard the tapping again. Tap, tap. It was louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the front door. It sounded like it was coming from the window in my room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint outline of something, or someone on the other side. My breath caught in my throat, and I stayed completely still, hoping whoever it was would go away. After a few moments, the tapping stopped. I stayed in bed, too scared to move, until I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I told Sarah and Emily what had happened. This time, they didn't laugh. Instead, they both looked uneasy. "We should leave," Emily said. "I don't care if we lose the money. Something isn't right here." Sarah and I agreed. We packed our bags quickly, eager to get out of the house. As we were loading our car, I noticed something on the front porch. It was a small pile of rocks, neatly stacked in a way that couldn't have been natural. We didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was tapping on the windows and doors of that cottage. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe there was something more sinister going on. All I know is that I've never been so relieved to leave a place in my life. That trip taught me to trust my instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And as beautiful as remote locations can be, sometimes being surrounded by people isn't such a bad thing. Our weekend trip to a small coastal town was supposed to be a relaxing break from the usual chaos of life. My fiancé, David, and I found a charming Airbnb on the outskirts of town. The listing described it as a beachside bungalow, just a short walk from the ocean. It looked perfect in the photos, bright, cozy, and surrounded by greenery. The reviews were glowing, and the host, Laura, seemed friendly and accommodating. We arrived late Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The bungalow was even more beautiful in person. It was a small white house with blue shutters, tucked behind a row of palm trees. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance was soothing, and the air smelled of salt and fresh flowers. Laura had left the key in a small lockbox by the front door, along with a welcome note and a basket of snacks. Inside, the house was spotless and tastefully decorated with nautical-themed decor. The living room had a large window that looked out onto the ocean, and the bedroom was cozy, with soft white linens and a big, comfortable bed. We unpacked quickly and decided to explore the beach before it got dark. The path to the shore was just a short walk through the backyard. It was a secluded spot, with no other houses or people in sight. The sand was cool under our feet, and the waves shimmered in the fading light. It felt like we had found our little slice of paradise. That first night was perfect. We cooked dinner together in the small kitchen, drank wine, and sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the ocean. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found such a beautiful place. But the peaceful feeling didn't last long. The next morning, I woke up early to make coffee. David was still asleep, so I tiptoed to the kitchen, trying not to wake him. As I poured the water into the coffee maker, I noticed something strange. The back door, which led to the yard and the beach, was slightly open. I frowned, sure that we had locked it the night before. I walked over and pushed it shut, locking it again. I told myself it was probably just the wind. This was an old house, after all, and things like that happened. When David woke up, I mentioned it to him. He shrugged it off, saying I probably hadn't latched it properly. I wanted to believe him, but a small part of me felt uneasy. We spent the day exploring the town, visiting little shops and eating seafood at a beachside restaurant. By the time we got back to the bungalow, it was late afternoon. We decided to spend the evening relaxing, watching a movie, and enjoying the cozy atmosphere. That night, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. The room was dark, and everything seemed quiet. But then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like someone stepping on an old wooden floorboard. I froze, my heart racing. The sound was coming from somewhere inside the house. "David," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What is it?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Listen," I said, my voice trembling. We both lay still, listening. The creaking came again, louder this time. It was coming from the living room. David sat up, grabbing his phone to use as a flashlight. "Stay here," he said, getting out of bed. "No way," I said, following him. We walked into the living room together, our footsteps barely making a sound on the floor. The room was empty, but the back door was open again. This time, it was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. "I locked it," I said, my voice shaking. David checked the door, then looked around the yard. There was no one there. "Maybe the lock is broken," he said, trying to sound calm. "Let's just double-check everything and go back to bed." We checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, we woke up to find the back door open again. This time, I was certain it wasn't just the wind. Someone had been in the house. "Let's call Laura," I said. "She needs to know about this." David agreed, and I sent her a message through the Airbnb app, explaining what had happened. She responded quickly, apologizing and saying she'd send someone to check the locks. We decided to spend the day out, hoping the fresh air would help us feel better. But as we were leaving the house, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the sand near the back porch. They weren't ours. They were larger, barefoot, and looked fresh. I showed them to David, and we both felt a wave of unease. "Let's just get out of here for a while," he said. We spent the day trying to distract ourselves, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. Who had been in our yard? And why? When we returned to the bungalow that evening, the locks had been replaced. Laura had sent a local handyman to fix them while we were out. I felt a little better knowing the doors were secure, but the uneasiness lingered. That night, I woke up again, this time to the sound of a soft thud. It was coming from the living room. "David," I whispered, shaking him awake. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. "Stay here," he said, getting out of bed. I followed him anyway, too scared to stay alone. When we entered the living room, we saw something that made my stomach drop. The back door was open again, and a man was standing just outside, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and his face was partially obscured. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at us. "Who are you?" David shouted, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, disappearing into the darkness. David slammed the door shut and locked it. "Call the police," he said, his face pale. I fumbled with my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, the man was long gone. They searched the area but found no sign of him. We packed our things that night and left the bungalow, too scared to stay another minute. Laura was apologetic when we told her what had happened. She said she had no idea who the man could have been and assured us she'd improve the security of the property. But the experience stayed with me. I kept thinking about that man, how he had been watching us, how he had opened the door again and again. The trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into something I'll never forget. Now, whenever I book an Airbnb, I always check the locks, and I never stay in places that feel too isolated. Some risks just aren't worth taking. It was a work trip, and I thought staying at an Airbnb would be a better option than a hotel. I wanted something more personal, cozy, and quiet, a place where I could relax after long meetings. The listing I chose seemed perfect. It was a private studio apartment in a nice suburban neighborhood. The reviews were excellent, the price was reasonable, and the photos showed a clean, well-kept space. The host, Jason, seemed friendly through our messages. He said he lived nearby and could be available if I needed anything. I liked the idea of someone being close, just in case. The description of the place mentioned that it was newly renovated, with a separate entrance for privacy. Everything sounded great. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The neighborhood was as quiet and pleasant as I'd hoped. Tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, and a sense of calm. The apartment was at the back of a larger house, with a little patio and a private entrance. Jason had left the key in a lockbox by the door, and everything seemed straightforward. When I stepped inside, the apartment looked just like the pictures. It was a small but cozy studio with a kitchenette, a couch, a desk, and a bed. The walls were painted a soothing gray, and the furniture was modern and clean. It smelled faintly of fresh paint, which added to the impression that the place was new. I unpacked my things and got comfortable. The first evening passed uneventfully. I worked on my laptop, had a simple dinner, and watched some TV before going to bed. The bed was soft, the blankets were warm, and I fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I woke up early to get ready for my meeting. As I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something strange. The bathroom window, which I was sure I had closed the night before, was slightly open. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I'd forgotten to close it properly. It was a new place, and I wasn't familiar with everything yet. I shut the window, locked it, and went about my day. The meeting lasted most of the day, and by the time I got back to the apartment, I was exhausted. I reheated some leftovers, took a quick shower, and settled into bed with a book. Around midnight, I was starting to doze off when I heard a faint noise. It sounded like a light tapping, coming from somewhere near the door. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster. I stayed quiet, listening, but the tapping stopped. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe the house creaking or something outside. I turned off the light and went back to sleep. The next day was quiet. I spent most of it working on my laptop in the apartment. I noticed, though, that I felt a little uneasy. It was hard to explain, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. The apartment had a few windows, and the curtains were open to let in natural light. I figured maybe I was just not used to being in a ground floor unit where anyone walking by could look in. I closed the curtains, hoping it would make me feel better. That evening, I decided to call it an early night. I had another busy day ahead and needed the rest. As I was lying in bed, I thought I heard something outside the window. It sounded like footsteps, soft but deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I got out of bed and peeked through the curtains, but I didn't see anything. The backyard was dark and empty. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went back to bed. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find the back door unlocked. I knew I had locked it the night before. I was sure of it. I always double-check locks before I go to bed, especially in a new place. Now my heart was racing. Had someone been in the apartment while I was sleeping? I checked all my belongings, but nothing was missing. Still, the idea of someone sneaking in while I was unaware made me feel sick. I messaged Jason, the host, to let him know what had happened. He replied quickly, apologizing and saying he'd come by to check the locks. He assured me the neighborhood was safe and that nothing like this had ever happened before. Jason came over that afternoon with a toolbox. He tested the locks, tightened some screws, and reassured me that everything should be fine now. He seemed kind and genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I was determined to stay alert. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything before going to bed. I even left a small lamp on in the corner of the room, hoping the light would make me feel safer. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the creak of a floorboard. Someone was inside the apartment. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I listened closely, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be near the kitchenette, just a few feet from the bed. Slowly, I reached for my phone, which was on the nightstand. I turned the screen on and tried to type as quietly as possible to call 911. The sound of footsteps moved closer. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel their presence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Finally, I hit call and whispered to the operator, "Someone is in my Airbnb. Please send help." The operator assured me that the police were on their way. I stayed on the line, trying not to make any noise. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The footsteps stopped. Whoever it was must have heard the sirens, too, because the next thing I heard was the back door creaking open. The police arrived minutes later. They searched the area, but didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. The officer suggested that maybe it was just a misunderstanding, but I knew what I had heard. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. Jason was apologetic when I told him what had happened, but I couldn't stay there another night. To this day, I don't know who was in that apartment or how they got in. The experience shook me, and it's made me much more cautious about where I stay when I travel. That trip taught me an important lesson. No matter how safe a place seems, you can never be too careful. Always trust your instincts, and don't ignore the little things that seem off. My cousin Jack and I had planned this trip for months. We were both busy with work and needed a break, so we decided to rent an Airbnb in a small mountain town we'd heard about. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to hike, explore nature, and just relax for a few days. The listing we found was a rustic cabin surrounded by trees, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest town. It looked perfect in the photos, with its wood-paneled walls, stone fireplace, and big windows that overlooked the forest. The reviews were excellent, and the host, a man named Paul, seemed friendly. We arrived in the late afternoon on a chilly Friday. The drive up the mountain was breathtaking, with winding roads and views of dense pine forests. When we reached the cabin, it was just as beautiful as we'd hoped. It was secluded, with no other houses in sight. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and earth. Paul had left the key in a lockbox by the door, and when we stepped inside, the cabin was warm and cozy. The living room had a big leather couch and a coffee table stacked with old books. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, and the bedroom had a big bed with thick quilts that looked inviting. We unpacked, made some coffee, and sat on the porch, soaking in the silence. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. It felt like we were in another world. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, played cards, and went to bed early, tired from the drive. But things started to feel strange the next day. The following morning, Jack and I decided to go for a hike. There were several trails near the cabin, and we picked one that led up to a scenic overlook. The hike was beautiful but tiring. and we didn't see a single other person the entire time. When we returned to the cabin in the early afternoon, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. "I thought you locked it," I said to Jack. "I did," he replied, frowning. We stepped inside cautiously, but everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place, and none of our belongings were missing. We assumed one of us must have forgotten to lock the door properly, even though I was sure I had seen Jack turn the lock before we left. Shrugging it off, we spent the rest of the day relaxing. We cooked dinner again, played more cards, and sat by the fireplace. By the time we went to bed, I'd almost forgotten about the door. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Jack getting up to use the bathroom. But as I lay there listening, I realized the footsteps were coming from the living room, and they were too heavy to be Jack's. "Jack," I whispered, nudging him awake. "What?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Do you hear that?" We both went silent, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. "Probably the house settling," Jack said, though he didn't sound convinced. Neither of us got up to check, and eventually we fell back asleep. The next morning, we woke up to find the door to the bedroom locked from the outside. At first, we thought it must be a mistake. Maybe one of us had accidentally flipped the lock before going to bed. But the lock was a simple latch on the outside of the door. There was no way we could have done it from inside the room. "That's not possible," Jack said, his voice tense. We managed to unlock the door, but the incident left us both on edge. Someone had to have been in the cabin while we were sleeping. We checked the entire place, looking for any signs of a break-in, but everything was normal. The windows were locked, and the front door showed no signs of tampering. I messaged Paul, the host, to let him know what had happened. He responded quickly, apologizing and saying he had no idea how it could have happened. He assured us that the area was safe and that he'd never had any problems with guests before. Still, the thought of someone being in the cabin while we slept was deeply unsettling. That evening, as we sat on the porch, I noticed something, or someone, moving in the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw it again, a figure, partially obscured by the shadows. It was a man, standing about 50 feet away, watching us. "Jack," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked where I was pointing, and his face went pale. "Do you see that?" The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us. "Hey," Jack called out, standing up. "What are you doing?" The man didn't respond. He took a step back, disappearing into the trees. We went inside and locked all the doors and windows, our nerves frayed. Jack wanted to call the police, but we weren't sure what to say. The man hadn't done anything. He was just standing there. Still, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, neither of us could sleep. Every little noise made us jump, and the cabin, which had felt so cozy before, now seemed ominous. Around midnight, we heard it again, footsteps, this time on the porch. Jack grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, his face set in determination. "Stay here," he said. "No way," I said, following him. We opened the door together, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The porch was empty, but there were fresh footprints in the dirt leading around the side of the cabin. We followed the tracks cautiously, our hearts pounding. They led to the back of the cabin, where we found something that made my stomach drop. The back door, which we had locked earlier, was wide open. We didn't go inside. Instead, we got in the car and drove to the nearest town. We stayed at a motel that night and contacted Paul the next morning. He was shocked and apologetic, insisting he had no idea who could have been lurking around the property. We didn't go back to the cabin. Paul refunded our stay, but the experience left a mark. Even now, I can't help but wonder who that man was and what he wanted. Was he just a drifter, or was there something more sinister going on? That trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the footsteps in the night, and the man in the shadows. It's made me think twice about staying in remote places, and about how much we really know about the places we rent online. It was late September when I decided to take a much-needed break from my life in the city. Work had been piling up, and my stress levels were through the roof. I longed for silence, fresh air, and time to clear my head. After scrolling through endless vacation rental sites, I found a cabin in the woods. It wasn't far from a small town, but far enough to feel isolated. The photos were beautiful: a rustic log cabin with a wraparound porch, a small fire pit outside, and endless forest surrounding it. The description promised a quiet retreat. The listing said it was a perfect escape, with no neighbors for miles. I booked it without hesitation, excited to leave my cramped apartment and the constant noise of the city behind. The day I left, the weather was clear and crisp. The drive out to the cabin took about 5 hours, winding through highways that gradually gave way to two-lane roads and then gravel paths. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The cabin looked even better in person. It sat on a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. I parked my car in front and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The air was cool and clean, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. I grabbed my bag and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin was cozy and welcoming. The living room had a large stone fireplace, a couch with a stack of blankets, and shelves filled with books and board games. The kitchen was small but fully equipped, and the bedroom had a big bed with a quilt that looked handmade. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in. After making a quick dinner and lighting the fireplace, I sat on the couch with a book. For the first time in weeks, I felt relaxed. The warmth of the fire, the quiet of the forest, and the lack of notifications from my phone, the signal was non-existent, were exactly what I needed. That first night, I slept like a rock. The bed was comfortable, and the silence was almost unnerving at first, but it soon became soothing. When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the curtains, and I felt refreshed. I spent the day exploring the area. There was a trail behind the cabin that led to a small creek. I walked for hours, enjoying the sounds of the forest and the feeling of being completely alone. The trees were beginning to turn, their leaves a mix of green, yellow, and red. I took photos, skipped stones in the creek, and sat on a fallen log, letting my mind wander. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting again. My legs were sore from walking, and I was looking forward to another quiet evening. After dinner, I decided to sit outside by the fire pit. I brought out a chair and a blanket and lit a small fire. The flames crackled, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. I leaned back, staring up at the stars. There were so many, more than I'd ever seen in the city. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the trees. I figured it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire and the stars. The rustling grew louder. It wasn't constant, more like intermittent bursts, as if something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. I turned my head toward the noise, but the firelight didn't reach far enough to illuminate the trees. I couldn't see anything. Probably just an animal, I told myself, though I didn't feel convinced. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, but the rustling didn't stop. Feeling uneasy, I doused the fire, grabbed my chair and blanket, and went back inside. The cabin felt different that night. The coziness I'd felt before was replaced with a sense of unease. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. The rustling outside continued for a while, but eventually it stopped. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing to worry about. The forest was full of animals, and I was just overthinking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally went to bed, I left the bedroom door open and kept a flashlight on the nightstand. I fell asleep eventually, but it wasn't the deep, restful sleep I'd had the night before. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling tired and on edge. I made coffee and sat on the porch, trying to calm my nerves. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, but I couldn't stop thinking about the rustling I'd heard the night before. After breakfast, I decided to go for another hike, hoping the exercise would help me relax. I took the same trail as the day before, but this time, I couldn't enjoy it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me. At one point, I stopped to listen. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals. Just silence. I turned back, deciding I'd had enough hiking for the day. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The back door was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. My stomach churned as I stepped inside, my heart pounding. Everything looked normal, nothing was out of place, and nothing was missing. Still, I felt like I was being watched. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks, faint thuds, and the occasional rustling outside. I told myself it was just the cabin settling or the wind in the trees, but my nerves were shot. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I locked the bedroom door, slid a chair under the doorknob, and kept the flashlight within reach. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was safe. Then I heard it, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the porch. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the footsteps moved closer to the door. There was a pause, and then I heard the doorknob rattle. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, dialing 911 as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I whispered to the operator, telling them someone was outside the cabin. They assured me that help was on the way, but the nearest police station was miles away. The footsteps continued, moving around the cabin. I heard them stop by one of the windows, then another. I stayed in the bedroom, clutching the flashlight and phone, my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely daring to breathe. When the police finally arrived, I ran outside to meet them. They searched the area but found no one. The officer told me it was probably a local or a hiker who'd gotten lost, but that didn't make me feel any better. I packed my things and left that night. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. The cabin owner apologized profusely and refunded my stay, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Even now, I get nervous when I hear noises at night, and I'll never stay in a cabin alone again. It was the perfect weekend getaway. After a long few months of working hard at my desk job, I was desperate for a break. I'd been scrolling through Airbnb listings for hours when I finally found a cabin that seemed perfect. It was a small, secluded place deep in the woods of Oregon, no neighbors for miles. The cabin's listing promised the peace and quiet I needed. It had a cozy feel to it, with wooden beams, a fireplace, and big windows that looked out onto nothing but trees. It was exactly the escape I had been looking for. The host was a woman named Emily. Her profile picture showed her standing next to the cabin, smiling in a flannel shirt. Her messages were brief but polite. She explained that the cabin was in a very remote area, so I should bring everything I might need, as the nearest grocery store was over 30 miles away. She also mentioned that there was no cell service in the area, which I found odd but didn't think too much of at the time. I rented the cabin for the weekend, arriving on a Friday evening. The weather was overcast, and the closer I got to the cabin, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind. The forest was dense, and the drive was long and bumpy. It was starting to feel like I was truly out in the middle of nowhere. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I was relieved to see the cabin, wooden with a front porch, surrounded by tall trees. There was a small stream running nearby, adding to the serene atmosphere. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of wood and old furniture greeted me, and the warmth from the wood stove in the living room made it feel homely. The cabin had a simple, rustic charm, just what I needed to unwind. After exploring the space for a few minutes, I unpacked my things and decided to relax by the fire. The crackling of the logs and the peaceful silence was soothing. I felt like I could finally breathe freely, far away from the noise and stress of everyday life. That night, I decided to go for a walk in the woods to take in the fresh air. I left the cabin and wandered along a narrow dirt path that wound through the trees. There was something almost magical about the quiet of the forest. I could hear only the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It felt like time slowed down, and the worries of the world faded away. As I walked deeper into the woods, something caught my attention. It was a sound, footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the underbrush, but then I realized the steps were too regular, too deliberate. I stopped walking and looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my imagination or perhaps a deer or some other animal. But as I continued my walk, the footsteps followed. Every time I stopped, I could hear them. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see a person walking behind me, but there was no one there. My heart started to race a little, and I began to feel uneasy. I tried to ignore it and kept walking, but the footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to be following me, always just out of sight. I turned and walked back toward the cabin, trying to brush off the odd feeling that something wasn't quite right. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was shaken. I locked the door behind me, tried to calm my nerves, and told myself I was just being paranoid. The cabin was far from any other people, and I couldn't think of any logical reason for someone to be out here with me. I went to bed that night, trying to push the unease out of my mind. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little more relaxed. The sun was shining through the windows, and the birds were chirping outside. I decided to forget about the weird footsteps and enjoy my day. I spent most of the morning exploring the nearby woods and taking pictures of the landscape. The cabin was as beautiful and peaceful as I had hoped. But that night, things started to take a strange turn. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book and listening to the fire crackling in the fireplace. The silence in the cabin was almost overwhelming. I looked at the clock. It was already past midnight. I decided to head to bed, feeling tired from the day's activities. As I passed through the kitchen, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when I looked again, I was sure of what I saw. There was a man standing in the living room, near the couch. He was around my age, maybe a bit older. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and shorts, and I could vaguely make out that he was holding a flashlight. The flashlight's red beam was shining directly on the couch, where my brother's two friends had fallen asleep earlier. The light flickered strangely, casting an eerie glow across the room. I froze in place. My first thought was that maybe someone from the property had come by to check on me. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't someone I knew. He was a stranger, white tall, and standing unnaturally still. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But when I looked again, he was gone. Panic set in. I moved closer to the balcony on the second floor, trying to get a better view. I looked out, but all I saw was pitch darkness. There were no lights, no movement, just trees. I couldn't even hear the sound of wind. It was as though everything had gone completely still. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just staring into the darkness, trying to figure out what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I just too tired? Or had someone actually been in the cabin with me? I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was wrong, so I went back to my room, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone, but there was no signal. The cabin was in such a remote area that I knew I wouldn't be able to get any service. I texted Emily, telling her that I thought someone was in the cabin, but I didn't get a response. I tried to sleep, but every small sound made me jump. I kept hearing creaking noises coming from downstairs, footsteps. Too loud to be the house settling, too deliberate. I wasn't sure if I was just imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was moving around downstairs. I didn't dare go down and check, though. I stayed under the covers, listening to every small sound, praying for the night to end. The next morning, I couldn't wait to leave. I packed my things quickly, feeling like I needed to get out of there. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, as I wasn't sure if they would believe me. When I went to the kitchen to grab my last bit of breakfast before leaving, I noticed something odd. There were muddy footprints on the floor. Not huge prints, but definitely noticeable. I don't know who had been in the cabin with me. I didn't know how they got in, or what they had been doing while I was upstairs. There were no signs of forced entry. Everything was locked, the windows were closed. It was as if they had just slipped in without making a sound. When I texted Emily to tell her about the footprints and the strange man I had seen, she seemed apologetic, but didn't seem too concerned. She told me the cabin had been rented out many times before, and a few previous guests had mentioned hearing strange noises or feeling like they weren't alone. But she assured me that it was all probably just a misunderstanding. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that place. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe someone had been in the cabin. Either way, I wasn't going to take any chances. I left that morning and haven't been back to that cabin since. To this day, I don't know who the man was or how he got into the cabin, but I'm never booking a remote Airbnb without checking the reviews for something like this again. I arrived in Barcelona late at night, exhausted from the flight. The summer heat lingered in the air, heavy and sticky, even as I stepped out of the airport. I had been searching for a decent apartment to rent for weeks, but everything was either overpriced or fully booked. The only affordable option I found was a private room in an apartment, listed as a 2-bedroom flat shared with the owner, a single woman with a cat. It seemed fine. Simple, nothing luxurious, but good enough for my stay. I had rented it mainly because I needed a place to work. I couldn't afford to blow my budget on a full apartment, but I at least wanted somewhere quiet, clean, and comfortable. The listing had shown a modest, tidy bedroom with a double bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the street. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. The host had messaged me throughout the day, reminding me of check-in instructions. She seemed friendly. I had no reason to be suspicious. After taking a taxi from the airport, I arrived at the building. It was old, with graffiti covering parts of the exterior walls, but that wasn't unusual in Barcelona. The area itself was lively, narrow streets lined with restaurants and bars still buzzing despite the late hour. I found the entrance, rang the buzzer, and after a few seconds, the door clicked open. I lugged my suitcase up the stairs, tired but relieved to finally be here. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and as I reached the landing, the door swung open before I even knocked. The woman standing there was smiling. She had a warm, overly enthusiastic energy, like someone greeting an old friend. She didn't turn on the lights as she led me inside, which struck me as odd, but I was too exhausted to care. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I noticed something strange. The place was a disaster. Even in the dark, I could make out piles of clothes, bags, and random objects scattered across the floor. The air was stuffy, with a faint, unpleasant smell lingering. She led me to my room, gesturing toward it like a game show host presenting a prize. I stepped inside and immediately felt my stomach sink. The room was the same one from the pictures, but it was completely empty. No bed, no desk, just a broken, sagging couch sitting where the bed should have been. I hesitated. I wanted to say something, but my brain was fogged with exhaustion. I had spent hours traveling. I needed sleep. So, I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. I could deal with it in the morning. I set down my suitcase, did a quick check for bed bugs, because at this point, I wouldn't have been surprised, and lay down on the awful couch, using my jacket as a pillow. The springs dug into my back, but I didn't care. Sleep took over quickly. I woke up sweating. The heat in the room was unbearable. Sunlight streamed through the window, making the whole place feel like an oven. My back ached from the couch, my neck stiff from the awkward position I had slept in. The first thing I noticed was the noise. Loud voices, footsteps, laughter. I sat up, still groggy, and glanced toward my door. It was slightly open. I had assumed this was a 2-bedroom apartment. Just me and the owner. But now, I was hearing multiple people. I stood up and stepped into the hallway. That's when I realized the place was much bigger than I thought. There weren't just 2 bedrooms, there were 4. And from what I could see, the other 2 rooms weren't regular bedrooms. They were crammed with bunk beds. Each room had at least 3 sets, meaning there were at least 12 people living in this apartment. 12 people. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't just a rental. This was some kind of illegal hostel. I tried to process it, but then I saw something that made my skin crawl. The owner was in the living room, sprawled out on what looked like a set of massage tables. She wasn't alone. There was a man next to her, completely naked. They were both naked. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man rolled over, half asleep, stretching like a cat. He wasn't some random guest. He was clearly her husband or boyfriend. I turned away quickly, feeling my face heat up with embarrassment and disgust. I made my way to the bathroom, needing to splash water on my face, to clear my head. But as soon as I got there, I realized I had another problem. There was only one bathroom, one toilet, one shower, for 12 people. A line had already formed. Some of the other guests were sitting on the floor, waiting their turn. The air smelled of sweat and mildew. Hygiene was clearly not a priority here. I backed away, deciding I could wait. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping to at least get some water. But as soon as I stepped inside, I froze. Cockroaches. Big, fat cockroaches crawling along the counters. I had lived in cities before. I knew cockroaches were common. But this was something else. There were dozens of them, scattering when I stepped closer. And to make things worse, the owner had put a lock on the fridge. I later found out that guests weren't allowed to use it. If you wanted to store food, you had to pay extra. Same with the laundry. If you wanted to wash your clothes, you had to pay her. I spent most of that afternoon in my room, trying to work. But the noise was unbearable. And then, at some point, I heard something that made my stomach turn. Moaning. Loud, unmistakable moaning. I felt my skin crawl. I forced myself to look out into the hallway. The owner and her husband were in the living room, having sex. On the massage tables. They didn't care that there were 12 other people in the apartment. They didn't care that the doors were open. They didn't care about anything. And then, as if to top it all off, when they finished, they left a bottle of anal lube on the living room table. Just sitting there, like a bottle of ketchup. That was it. I needed to get out. I contacted Airbnb, sent them pictures, explained everything. Their response: they refused to do anything. They told me I had to ask the owner for a refund. I did, and the owner physically threatened me. At that moment, I knew I had only one option. I told her that if she didn't give me a refund, I would report her to the city authorities. Barcelona has strict laws against unregistered Airbnbs, and I knew she wasn't following them. She panicked. We went back and forth, but in the end, she caved. I got part of my money back, enough to book a hotel for the next few nights. I grabbed my bags and left. As soon as I was outside, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I reported the listing. A few days later, it was gone from Airbnb. I don't know if they shut it down or if she just changed the name and kept renting it, but I do know this: I will never stay in a shared Airbnb again. I pulled into the driveway just as the sun started dipping below the horizon. The house was a single-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, just a standard, well-kept house with beige siding and a small front porch. Nothing about it stood out, which I liked. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted for a short, peaceful getaway. I turned off the car and exhaled, stretching my fingers from the steering wheel. It had been a long drive, and I was glad to be here. I checked my phone for the entry instructions. There it was, the code for the electronic door lock, just as the Airbnb listing had provided. Before heading in, we decided to grab the groceries first. It made the most sense. Some of the items needed refrigeration, and I didn't want anything spoiling while we unpacked the rest of our things. I stepped up onto the porch, entered the code into the keypad, and heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. The door swung open easily. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cleaning products. It was a little dim, the evening light filtering through closed blinds. I reached for a light switch, flipping it on. A warm, yellow glow filled the entryway, leading into an open-concept kitchen and living room. The kitchen was our first stop. Carrying in the first round of grocery bags, I made my way to the refrigerator. I grabbed the handle, pulled it open, and froze. The fridge was packed, not just with a few forgotten items or condiments left behind by previous guests, but completely full. There were eggs, a half-used gallon of milk, a plastic container of what looked like leftovers, juice, yogurt, and a nearly full stick of butter. In the crisper drawers, vegetables were still wrapped in store packaging, fresh enough that they hadn't gone bad yet. A loaf of bread sat on the counter beside a half-used jar of peanut butter. My stomach tightened. This wasn't normal. I glanced over my shoulder at the rest of the kitchen. More things caught my eye: personal belongings, little items that no temporary rental should have. A coffee mug sat on the counter with a spoon still in it. Next to the sink, a cutting board had faint knife marks, as if it had been used recently. A dish towel hung over the oven handle. I stepped back, looking around, my mind racing. I called out, just in case. No answer. I walked further into the house, past the kitchen into the living room. It was neatly arranged, too neatly. The kind of neatness that comes from someone tidying up before heading out for the day, not from a property being staged for short-term rentals. A pair of house slippers sat beside the couch. A book with a bookmark sticking out lay on the coffee table. There was a small pile of unopened mail sitting in a tray by the front door. I hurried back outside to the car, my pulse pounding. We weren't supposed to be here. This wasn't just a house that hadn't been properly cleaned. Someone still lived here. Back in the car, I pulled up the Airbnb app and found the customer service number. After what felt like forever on hold, I finally got through. I explained what we had found, my voice tight with anxiety. The rep on the phone was calm, almost too calm. They assured me it was fine, that the homeowner had been supposed to clear out their belongings, but apparently hadn't gotten around to it. The house was still ours to stay in, they said. We should just push things aside and make ourselves comfortable. That didn't sit right with me. This wasn't a few leftover items. It was a house that someone had clearly been living in. I voiced my concerns, but they brushed it off. The owner assured us it's fine, they repeated. You're good to stay. Against my better judgment, I hesitated, then finally decided to go back inside. We agreed that if we were going to stay, we needed to at least clear some space. I didn't feel right leaving someone's things lying around, so I started moving items into a large hall closet near the kitchen. That's when I found the medication. Half-used bottles, prescription labels still intact. I held one up, my eyes scanning the name of the medication. It was unfamiliar, but a quick look at the accompanying paperwork told me everything I needed to know. These were cancer medications. Strong ones. Medications used in aggressive treatments. The paperwork was what really made my stomach drop. It was a mix of medical bills, insurance forms, and handwritten notes. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Whoever had lived here had been receiving treatment for stage 4 cancer. I sat back on my heels, the papers still in my hands. I pieced things together as I sifted through more documents. Hospital discharge papers, appointment schedules, then, finally, a form indicating the transportation of remains. A one-way trip. Suddenly, everything made sense. The owner had passed away, and from what I was seeing, their children, who must have inherited the house, had never come back to clear it out. Instead, they had decided to rent it out as an Airbnb, leaving everything as it was. A terrible feeling settled in my chest. We weren't just staying in someone else's home. We were staying in the remnants of someone's life, frozen in time. The mail on the counter hadn't been checked because no one was here to check it. The half-used food in the fridge had belonged to someone who never came back. The book on the table was left open to a page that would never be finished. And here we were, strangers, picking through what was left behind. I looked around again, and now the house felt different. Not haunted, not eerie in a supernatural way, but heavy with absence. Like walking into a room where someone had just been, only to realize they were never coming back. We couldn't stay here. I picked up my phone and called the Airbnb support line again. This time, I didn't ask. I told them we were leaving. I wasn't going to sleep in a stranger's home, surrounded by their unfinished life, their uncollected mail, their untouched food. I demanded a refund. After a long back and forth, they finally relented. We packed up, took our groceries back to the car, and left. I didn't look back as we pulled out of the driveway. The Airbnb listing disappeared from the site a few days later. I don't know if the family finally came to clear things out, or if someone else booked it, only to have the same experience we did. But I do know one thing. Some places aren't ready to be rented. Some homes aren't meant to be stayed in by strangers. And sometimes, you walk into a house thinking it's just another vacation rental, only to realize it's something else entirely. Narvik, Norway. The farthest north you can travel by train in Europe. I had spent the summer in Sweden, working remotely and exploring, and I wanted to end my trip with something different. The long, 20-hour train ride from Stockholm seemed like the perfect way to see more of Scandinavia. And since it was still late summer, the landscapes would be incredible. I booked a private room in an Airbnb, just a basic setup, an apartment with a male and female couple who lived there. The communication with them had been fine leading up to my arrival, and they told me they wouldn't be home when I got there. They left the key in a lockbox by the door, so it seemed simple enough. By the time I arrived, I was exhausted. The train ride was scenic, but long, and I was eager to drop my bags, maybe grab a shower, and find something to eat before I crashed for the night. I made my way through the small town toward the apartment building, following the directions the hosts had sent me. The area was quiet, almost eerily so. Narvik wasn't a bustling place, but I expected at least some movement, people coming home from work or out for an evening walk. Instead, the streets were empty. The wind coming off the fjord was cold, even in summer, and it carried a damp, metallic smell. I found the building an older, nondescript apartment block with peeling paint on the doors and rust along the metal stair railings. It looked worn down, but not unusual for a town this far north. I punched in the code, took the key, and climbed the 2 flights of stairs to the apartment. That's when I smelled it. It wasn't just bad, it was a stench that felt alive. Thick, sour, and suffocating. The kind of smell that settles deep into carpets and walls and never leaves. It was a mixture of sweat, old food, and something else. Something rotten. I hesitated at the door. A voice in my head told me to turn around, but I was exhausted, and I had already paid for the room. Maybe the place just needed to be aired out. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The mess hit me immediately. Clothes, shoes, and random junk were scattered across the floor. The kitchen was the first thing I saw to my left, and it looked like someone had been cooking when they left in a hurry. The electric stove was still on, a pan sitting on one of the burners with something charred and unidentifiable stuck to the surface. The air had that burnt food bitterness mixed with the stench of unwashed dishes piled in the sink. I turned off the stove. The last thing I needed was to start a fire. The The apartment was dimly lit, but I could still see enough. The walls were stained, the furniture looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, and the floor had sticky patches where my shoes almost stuck when I stepped. I made my way toward my room, hoping that at least my space would be better. But when I opened the door, my stomach turned. The bed, if you could call it that, had crumpled, clearly used sheets on it. Stains I didn't want to think about. The floor was covered in random clothes, socks, underwear, and wrappers. A half-empty bottle of cheap liquor sat on the nightstand next to an overflowing ashtray. I took a deep breath, trying to push past the rising panic in my chest. Maybe the hosts had left in a hurry. Maybe they meant to clean but didn't have time. I told myself a lot of things in those first few minutes, just to keep from walking right back out the door. Then I saw the bathroom. It was small, just a toilet, sink, and shower crammed into a tight space. But the filth was overwhelming. The toilet bowl was stained yellow and brown, with streaks running down from the rim. The sink was crusted with dried toothpaste, hair, and grime. The shower had a moldy curtain, and the tiles were dark with mildew. There was no way in hell I was stepping barefoot in there. I backed out, my brain finally catching up to what my gut had been screaming since I opened the door. I needed to get out. I grabbed my phone and tried to connect to the Wi-Fi to book a hotel, but the network wouldn't work. I tried the credentials the hosts had sent, but nothing. Frustrated, I used my data instead, quickly searching for nearby hotels. My signal was weak, and by the time I loaded a list, I had eaten through nearly all my remaining data. I found a place not too far, but I needed to book it fast before I lost connection. I stepped outside to get a better signal. The cool air was a relief after the thick, rancid heat of the apartment. I stood on the landing, refreshing my screen, trying to complete my booking before I ran out of data entirely. That's when I noticed the old woman. She was on the balcony across from me, hanging laundry. At first, she just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then she frowned. I glanced back at my phone, but she kept staring. When I looked up again, she was shaking her head slowly. I tried to ignore her, but she moved toward me, stepping closer to the railing. Her face changed, her eyes widening in alarm. She raised her hands above her head, baring her teeth like an animal. Then she growled. Not a sound of frustration. Not a casual, old person muttering. A deep, guttural, animalistic growl. She turned, pointed at the apartment behind me, and repeated the growl. Then she made a shooing motion toward the street, her wrinkled hands flicking urgently. I didn't need her to say more. I turned, ran back inside, grabbed my bag, and left the key on the table without even shutting the door. I didn't look back. I just walked. Fast. By the time I reached the hotel, my heart was still pounding. I checked in, went straight to my room, and locked the door. The relief of being in a clean space, away from that smell, away from whatever the hell that apartment was, I could finally breathe again. I never got an explanation for what happened in that place. I didn't ask. All I knew was that I had trusted my gut, and for once, I was glad I did. Costa Rica had always been on my list of places to visit, but I never expected my first trip there to be like this. My brother, his wife, their 2-year-old son, and I had all flown down for a friend's wedding. We had booked a 2-week stay in a private bungalow inside what was advertised as a secure, child-friendly compound. The listing had glowing reviews, beautiful pictures, and all the amenities we needed, including air conditioning, a washer and dryer, which was essential with a toddler in cloth diapers, and a fully stocked kitchen. It was supposed to be perfect. After the long flight, a brutal wait at customs, and a stressful rental car pickup, we were all ready to settle in, drop our bags, and get some rest. The drive to the Airbnb took us down winding roads, past lush green jungle, and through small towns with stray dogs wandering in and out of traffic. It felt like a different world from home, and I was excited to finally be here. As we got closer, I started noticing that the area didn't look quite like I expected. The pictures from the listing had shown a well-maintained resort-like compound with trimmed grass, palm trees, and smooth walking paths. Instead, we turned onto a dirt road full of potholes, dust kicking up behind the car as we crawled along at a snail's pace. And then we saw it. The secure, child-friendly compound was a yard full of cacti, broken glass, and scattered fire pits. There was no clear parking area, just uneven patches of dirt with some old car parts and a few half-buried beer cans. A couple of chickens pecked at the ground near a sagging wire fence. and beyond them was a cluster of mismatched buildings. My brother slowed the car. "This can't be it," I muttered. But the pin on the map said otherwise. As we pulled up, we saw something even stranger. A family, 2 parents and 2 kids, was inside the bungalow we had rented. They weren't just looking around or passing through. They had fully moved in. Their bags were inside, towels hanging over the railings, and one of the kids was running barefoot across the porch. I could already feel my stomach twisting. We got out of the car, still trying to process what was happening. The parents came outside, looking uncomfortable but not exactly surprised to see us. As it turned out, they had rented a different house on the property, a 2-story treehouse. But when they arrived, they decided they liked our bungalow better. So they just took it. They admitted they knew it wasn't theirs but figured no one else was coming, so they moved in anyway. I had no words. To their credit, they did apologize and started packing up their stuff when we asked what was going on. But that didn't change the fact that they had been touching everything in the house. This was right as COVID was starting to ramp up, and the idea of staying in a place where another family had just been living, touching every surface, using every dish, sleeping in the beds, it wasn't ideal. But we were tired. Maybe we could just wipe everything down, open some windows, and settle in. That plan lasted about 10 minutes. The moment we stepped inside, I knew there was no way we were staying. The house wasn't just dirty, it was infested. The doors to the outside all had huge, 2-inch gaps at the bottom, meaning anything could crawl in, and everything had. The kitchen was swarming with ants, moving in thick lines across the counters and into the cabinets. Huge spiders lurked in the bathroom corners, their thick legs twitching as they clung to the walls. Roaches clung to the ceiling, and the sound of them skittering over the wood sent chills down my spine. Then we realized the air conditioning didn't work. Neither did the fans. The place was already humid and stifling, and now we had no way to cool it down. The final straw came when my sister-in-law went to check the washer and dryer. They weren't there. The listing had clearly said we would have one, but when we messaged the host, he brushed it off. "Oh, someone will pick up your laundry and do it for you." That wasn't going to work. Not with a toddler in cloth diapers. The idea of handing over our kids' soiled diapers to some stranger and waiting for them to bring them back, who knew when, was insane. At that point, my sister-in-law looked ready to kill someone. We gave up. We immediately started looking for another Airbnb, anything that wasn't crawling with bugs and falling apart. After an hour of searching, we finally found a place about 10 minutes down the road. It was available, it looked clean, and it actually had the amenities it promised. We booked it, packed our bags back into the car, and left. The host was furious. The moment he realized we were leaving, he started sending messages, accusing us of overreacting, saying we were ruining his business, that we were exaggerating about the bugs. Then he left us a bad review on Airbnb, painting us as difficult guests who had made up complaints to get out of our stay. And to top it all off, we didn't even get all our money back. We had booked for 2 weeks, and even though we were there for less than a day, the refund process was a nightmare. Airbnb sided with him for most of it, and we ended up eating the cost of several nights before they finally agreed to refund part of the stay. The only silver lining was that the second place we booked was beautiful. Clean, modern, exactly as described. It was everything the first place wasn't. The rest of the trip ended up being great, but that first day was a disaster. It was a lesson learned the hard way. No matter how nice the pictures look, no matter how good the reviews are, you never really know what you're going to get until you step inside. It was the summer of 2018, my brother's bachelor party, a week-long trip to a remote Airbnb cabin deep in the forests of Wyoming, the kind of place where you could drive for miles and never see another soul. No stores, no gas stations, no streetlights, just dense, endless trees and an occasional dirt road cutting through the wilderness. It was a beautiful place, though. The cabin itself was big enough for the 6 of us, 2 floors, a wide porch, and a small river within walking distance. The air was crisp and clean. The nights were silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of the trees. No traffic, no city noise, no distractions, just us, the outdoors, and the endless green of the forest. The first few days were everything we wanted. Hiking during the day, playing football in the clearing near the cabin, grilling out as the sun set behind the pines. The air smelled of burning wood and sizzling meat, beer bottles clinking together as we sat around the fire talking about nothing and everything. No responsibilities, no stress, just the kind of freedom that only comes with being completely disconnected from the outside world. By the fourth day, things got heavier. The hikes got shorter, the beers got stronger. We sat around the cabin, drinking like it was a competition. Someone found an old speaker in the cabin, and we blasted music late into the night, shouting over each other about old memories, exes, regrets, inside jokes that didn't even make sense anymore. Bottles scattered across the wooden floors, cigarettes burned down to their filters on the porch railing. We were reckless, messy, loud. That night, we drank until we couldn't anymore. One by one, we crashed wherever we landed. Two of my brother's friends passed out on the living room couch, snoring loudly, beer cans still clutched in their hands. Another sprawled out on the floor with a jacket over his head. My brother made it to his bed, and somehow, I managed to get up the stairs to my room. Then, at around 4 a.m., I woke up with a sick feeling in my stomach. The kind of sickness that demands immediate action. I stumbled out of bed, barely making it to the bathroom before I vomited everything I had in me. The room spun as I leaned over the toilet, gripping the edges like they were the only thing keeping me from falling into some endless abyss. When it was over, I sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, waiting for the dizziness to pass. My head pounded, my throat burned, but at least the nausea was gone. I rinsed my mouth with water from the sink, splashed some on my face, and finally felt stable enough to walk back to my room. That's when I saw it. As I stepped out of the bathroom and turned toward the stairs, my eyes caught movement in the living room below. A faint, pulsing glow. Red light. I froze. At first, my foggy, drunken brain struggled to process what I was seeing. A man, standing in the living room. A stranger. He looked to be around my age, maybe mid-20s. White, short brown hair, wearing a plain t-shirt and shorts. No shoes. He held a flashlight, but the beam wasn't white. It was red, casting an eerie glow over the room. And he was shining it directly at my brother's friends on the couch. Slowly, methodically, as if studying them. My breath caught in my throat. Who the fuck was that? For a second, I thought I was hallucinating, maybe still too drunk to see clearly. I rubbed my eyes, blinked hard. When I looked again, gone. The red light, the man, all of it. Nothing but darkness. I stood there, my body tensed, waiting for something, anything to happen. A sound, a movement, a door creaking open. Nothing. I leaned over the wooden railing, trying to get a better view of the living room below, but it was pitch black. The only light was the faint glow from the dying embers in the fireplace. I needed to turn on the lights, but the switch was downstairs, right near the bottom of the steps. I hesitated, my mind racing. Had I really just seen someone? Or was it a drunken trick of the light? I turned back toward my room to grab my phone, only to realize I had left it downstairs with the others. Shit. For the next several minutes, I just stood there, completely still, listening. My ears strained against the silence, trying to pick up the sound of movement, a breath, the shuffle of footsteps, anything. But there was nothing. No doors opening, no windows creaking. The cabin was silent. After a long time, I finally moved. Slowly, carefully, I stepped back into my room and shut the door. I didn't bother locking it. I knew that if someone had already gotten inside, a flimsy wooden lock wouldn't do shit. Instead, I sat down on the edge of my bed and just listened. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every small noise, every gust of wind, every shifting floorboard sent my heart pounding. But nothing happened. When morning finally came, I stepped out of my room, my body aching from sitting stiffly for hours. Sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the cabin with its usual warmth. Everything looked normal. No open doors, no broken windows. No footprints on the dusty wooden floors. I checked the locks. Secure. The windows? All shut tight. I told my brother what I had seen. He laughed, chalked it up to a drunken hallucination. His friends did the same, insisting they would have woken up if someone had been in the room shining a red flashlight on them. But I know what I saw. A man, standing there, watching. And to this day, I still don't have an explanation. Who was he? How did he get into the cabin? Why was he carrying a red flashlight? And more importantly, how did he leave without making a single sound? The cabin was miles from the nearest road. No cars. No signs of footsteps outside. No way someone just happened to wander into our cabin that deep in the woods, in the middle of the night, in nothing but a t-shirt and shorts. I never found out the truth. I never saw that man again. But every time I think back to that night, I can still see the red light, glowing faintly in the darkness. I needed a place to stay for a month. My lease was up, and I was between apartments, waiting for the paperwork on a new spot to go through. Moving in with friends wasn't an option, and hotels were too expensive, so I figured Airbnb would be my best bet. I'd stayed in a few before, mostly short-term, but this time I needed something longer. I scrolled through listings until I found a decent one. A small apartment in a quiet part of town, nothing fancy but affordable. The host had good reviews. A middle-aged guy named Mark. His profile picture was just him, smiling in front of a white wall, nothing memorable about it. The listing mentioned he worked from home, but wouldn't be around much. That was fine with me. I just needed a place to sleep, shower, and work from my laptop. The apartment itself was basic but comfortable. A small living room with a couch, a coffee table, and a TV that didn't have any streaming apps, just basic cable. A kitchen with mismatched plates and silverware. A fridge that made a weird buzzing sound sometimes but worked fine. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a dresser, but it was clean, and that's all I cared about. For the first week, everything was fine. I worked, went out, came back, and barely saw the host. I'd hear him sometimes in his part of the unit, a separate section of the house connected by a locked door, but we never really crossed paths. Then, I started seeing a girl. We'd met a few weeks before, and things were going well. Nothing serious, just casual. She'd come over a couple of nights, we'd hang out, watch a movie, and she'd stay over. Nothing out of the ordinary. That's when things got weird. A few days after she first stayed the night, I woke up to an email from Airbnb. A message from the host. He was concerned. Said he had noticed I was bringing women over late at night, and wanted to remind me that the apartment was for one guest only. I thought it was weird that he even knew, but whatever. Maybe he saw her come in. Maybe he heard us. I responded, saying I understood, but she was just a friend, not another guest. A few nights later, she came over again. The next morning, another message from the host. This one was more direct. He accused me of bringing prostitutes back to the apartment. Said he had seen it before and wouldn't allow that kind of behavior in his place. I was stunned. Where was this coming from? I ignored the message for a while, unsure how to even respond. Eventually, I replied, telling him he was mistaken, but I could tell from his wording that he had already made up his mind. After that, the vibe in the apartment changed. I started noticing things that hadn't stood out before. The way the Wi-Fi seemed to slow down when I was on my laptop late at night. The way the locked door leading to a section of the unit seemed different. One night, I walked past it and thought I heard movement. A slight shuffling sound, like someone shifting their weight. The door had no peephole, no way for me to see what was on the other side. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the sound was gone. Then the small things started adding up. One evening, I came back from dinner and found the thermostat turned up way higher than I ever set it. Almost like someone had come in and changed it. Another night, I went to grab a bottle of water from the fridge and realized the position of things had shifted. The condiments in the door weren't where I'd left them. The carton of eggs was on the wrong shelf. At first, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was imagining it. But then I noticed something that I knew I hadn't done. The bathroom mirror had smudges on it. Faint streaks, like someone had wiped it with their palm. That was the moment I knew, without a doubt, that someone had been in the apartment when I wasn't there. I started getting anxious. I locked my bedroom door at night, even though it didn't feel like enough. I started checking the front door multiple times before bed, making sure it was secure. But the messages kept coming. The host was persistent. He knew I had company over. He was certain I was bringing prostitutes back. He said he had evidence. What evidence? I started to wonder if there were cameras in the apartment. It wasn't supposed to be allowed, but how else was he so sure of what I was doing? How was he so confident? I searched, checked the smoke detectors, the vents, even the tiny cracks between the ceiling panels. I didn't find anything, but that didn't mean they weren't there. I told the girl about it, and she didn't come back after that. Said it was too creepy. I couldn't blame her. Then, the worst message came. Airbnb had suspended my account. The host had reported me for violating house rules, claiming I had repeatedly brought escorts to the apartment. Said I was engaging in illegal activity. I tried to fight it, but Airbnb support wouldn't listen. They valued the host's safety concerns and upheld the suspension. My month-long stay had been cut short, and I had 3 days to leave. By that point, I was relieved. I packed my things immediately, but I still had to stay those last few nights. I barely slept. I kept expecting to hear the locked door creak open in the middle of the night. I kept thinking I'd wake up to find the host standing over my bed. On my last night there, something happened that still makes my skin crawl. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. My bags were packed. I just needed to make it through one more night. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the other side of the locked door. I held my breath, listening. The tapping continued. Soft, deliberate. Not like someone accidentally bumping into the door, but like someone waiting. I stayed completely still. After maybe a minute, the tapping stopped. But I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then the knob twisted. It didn't turn all the way, just enough to test if it was locked. I stayed frozen. My body was rigid, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the bed. Then silence. I waited, staring at the door, for what felt like hours. Nothing else happened. No footsteps. No retreating sounds. Just silence. When morning finally came, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. I still don't know what the host's deal was. If he really believed what he was saying, or if it was just an excuse to get me out. If he was watching me. If he had been inside my apartment when I was gone. All I know is that when I looked up his listing a month later, it was gone. His account gone. And I never found out why. I was driving across the U.S., a trip I had planned for months. Nothing fancy, just me, my car, and a rough route mapped out through different states. I wasn't trying to stay in hotels every night. That would have drained my budget fast. Airbnb was the way to go, and I usually stuck to the cheapest options. Rooms in shared houses, couches, whatever worked. That's how I ended up at this place in Kansas City, Missouri. The listing was simple. Couch to crash on. It was cheap. Really cheap. The reviews were mixed, but most of them just mentioned that it was basic. That didn't bother me. I wasn't looking for luxury. Just a place to sleep. I booked 2 nights. When I arrived, it was late evening. The house was a single-story rental, in a part of town that felt rundown, but not outright dangerous. The kind of place where people kept their porch lights off and their blinds shut. I knocked, and after a moment, the host answered. He looked like he was in his late 20s, a little older than me. Thin, pale, unshaven. He had that wiry kind of build, like someone who either ran marathons or just didn't eat much. His clothes were wrinkled, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He barely spoke, just nodded, stepped aside, and let me in. Inside, the place was dimly lit and cluttered. The kitchen was immediately to my left. The counter was covered in bottles of supplements, vitamins, powders, pills, and unmarked containers. More than I'd ever seen in one place. There were no plates, no cups, no forks or spoons. Just 2 knives sitting on the counter. The trash can was overflowing with Uber Eats bags, stacked on top of each other, like he hadn't taken the garbage out in weeks. The air smelled stale, like old takeout and unwashed laundry. Then there was the couch. It wasn't really a couch. It was 2 large armchairs side by side. Not even close to something you could stretch out on. I stood there for a second, looking at them, trying to figure out how the hell I was supposed to sleep. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. The guy turned to me and said, well, he didn't say anything because I wasn't going to include dialogue, but he made it clear. No pissing while standing. That was a house rule. I had to sit down to pee. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to know. I just nodded, threw my backpack down by the couch, and sat for a minute, taking in the room. The host stuck to his room after that. He didn't make small talk. Didn't ask about my trip. Just disappeared behind a door, leaving me alone in the cluttered, dimly lit house. I sat there, scrolling on my phone, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut. Something about the place was off. It wasn't just messy. It wasn't just cheap. It was something else. I got up to use the bathroom. Inside, the sink was full of hair. Not just a little. Clumps of it. Like someone had shaved their head and just left it there. The shower curtain was missing. The mirror was streaked with old water stains. The toilet seat was down, and I sure as hell wasn't about to lift it to see what was underneath. I did what I needed to do sitting down, because I wasn't in the mood to test house rules. When I got back to the couch, I tried to settle in. I shifted, twisted, turned, but there was no way to get comfortable. The air felt heavy, like the walls were pressing in. The house was too quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, where everything feels peaceful. The bad kind. The kind where you feel like something is watching you. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the hair in the sink, the knives on the counter. The host barely saying a word. My mind started spinning. Why did he need that many supplements? Why no cutlery, but 2 knives? Why no standing to pee? It wasn't one big thing that made me uneasy. It was 100 little things stacking up in my brain. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a creaking sound. I opened my eyes, heart pounding. Silence. I lay there, completely still, listening. Then I heard it again. A slow creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floor, coming from the hallway. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited. Listened. Nothing. But that was worse. Because now I knew I wasn't alone in the room. My gut was screaming at me, leave. I grabbed my bag, moved as quietly as I could to the front door, and slipped out. My car was parked just down the street. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there, trying to calm my heartbeat. I didn't know what had woken me up. Maybe the house was just old. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe it was nothing. But I wasn't going back in. I grabbed my phone, canceled my second night, and found a 24-hour gas station nearby. I drove there, parked, and slept in my car. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't great. But it felt safe. The next morning, I got back on the road, leaving Kansas City behind. I've stayed in a lot of weird places since then. Some dirty, some uncomfortable, some just plain gross. But that house, that was the only one that ever made me feel like I needed to run. I booked the place because it looked different from anywhere I'd stayed before. Most Airbnbs were modern apartments or basic homes, but this one had character. A Victorian-style house, built in the early 1900s, tucked away on a quiet street lined with old trees. The photos showed antique furniture, floral wallpaper, and those old-fashioned chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a museum. It wasn't the cheapest option, but the idea of staying in a house with real history appealed to me. It felt unique, like something out of a novel. The reviews were good, too. Guests raved about how cozy and charming it was. The host, Lisa, was friendly in her messages. She let me know she and her husband would be out of town during my stay, but if I needed anything, her co-host, David, lived nearby and could help. That was fine with me. I actually liked the idea of having the whole house to myself for a few nights. When I arrived, the house looked just like the photos. Even better, actually. It had a towering, sloped roof, those tall, narrow windows you only see in old houses, and a front porch with a wooden swing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. The floors creaked under my feet, and every piece of furniture looked like it had been there for decades. The bathroom, though, was small and felt different from the rest of the house. While the other rooms were carefully decorated, the bathroom seemed almost forgotten. Plain white walls, an old clawfoot tub, and a sink with separate hot and cold taps. The doorknob was one of those round brass ones, slightly discolored, with a keyhole beneath it. It felt stiff when I first turned it, but it worked, so I didn't think much of it. The first night was peaceful. I made tea, watched a movie on my laptop, and eventually went to bed. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak from the old wooden frame settling. I wasn't scared. If anything, I felt relaxed, like I had stepped back in time. The next night, though, everything changed. I had been out all day exploring the city, walking miles through different neighborhoods. By the time I got back to the house, my feet ached, and I was sweaty from the humid air. A hot shower sounded perfect. I plugged my phone into a small speaker and played music as I undressed. The shower water was surprisingly good, hot, with decent pressure, something you don't always get in old houses. The steam filled the room, fogging up the mirror. It was peaceful, standing there under the water, the sound of the music drowning out everything else. When I finished, I reached for my towel, dried off, and grabbed the doorknob to leave. It didn't turn. I frowned, tightening my grip and trying again. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, twisting the knob left and right, but it was stuck. The door didn't move. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence. I took a deep breath. It's an old house. Old houses have weird quirks. Maybe the wood had swollen from the steam. Maybe the knob was just stiff. I tried again, gripping the knob with both hands, twisting with all my strength. Nothing. That's when my mind started racing. Had someone locked me in? The thought hit me hard. What if someone had been in the house while I was in the shower? What if they were in the bedroom right now, going through my stuff. I looked down at my phone, sitting on the sink. Thank God. If I hadn't brought it in to play music, I would have been trapped without any way to call for help. I pulled up the Airbnb app and messaged Lisa, my fingers shaking slightly. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though my heart was pounding. She responded within a minute. She apologized, said the door had been acting up lately, and told me she'd call David, the co-host. That was good, but it didn't stop the uneasy feeling in my chest. I was still locked in, and I still didn't know why. I checked the keyhole under the knob, wondering if maybe I could unlock it myself. No key. Not that it would have helped. I was on the wrong side of the door. I sat on the edge of the tub, my legs bouncing as I waited. Every sound in the house felt amplified. A faint creak from the hallway, the distant ticking of a clock, the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the small space. Minutes passed. Then, finally, a knock on the front door. David. I shouted that I was in the bathroom. A moment later, I heard him moving through the house. Then, the sound of the knob turning from the outside. It stuck at first, then gave way with a loud click. The door swung open, and I practically stumbled out. I was shaking, wrapped in just a towel, but all I could think about was checking the rest of the house. I rushed to my bedroom. My bag was still there. My wallet. My laptop. Nothing was missing. So had the door really just jammed? Or had someone been there? I couldn't stop thinking about it. After David left, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bathroom door, still slightly ajar. I could see the knob, sitting there innocently, like it hadn't just trapped me inside for nearly an hour. I couldn't sleep. The idea of being alone in the house suddenly felt wrong. Every sound made me jump. Every creak in the floorboards. Every groan of the old wooden frame. I turned on every light in the house. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway. Even the bathroom, despite how much I hated looking at it now. I had never been superstitious, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that darkness meant vulnerability. That light was the only thing keeping me safe. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the lamps burning beside me. The shadows seemed less threatening that way. Morning couldn't come fast enough. By the time the sun finally rose, I had made up my mind. I packed my things, sent Lisa a polite but firm message explaining that I wasn't comfortable staying another night, and checked out early. She was apologetic, offered a refund for the remaining nights, but I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to be out of that house. Even now, I still don't know what really happened. Maybe it was just an old faulty doorknob. Maybe it was just bad timing. But a part of me still wonders, if I hadn't had my phone, how long would I have been in there? And worse, would I have been alone? Work trips can be exhausting, but at least this one came with an entire house to rent. That was the plan, anyway. A few coworkers and I were sent to another city for a big project, and instead of getting separate hotel rooms, we decided to pool our money and rent a house through Airbnb. It made sense. More space, a kitchen, and a living room where we could actually relax after long work days. We found a decent-looking house at a good price. The reviews weren't amazing, but nothing outright bad. Just complaints about it being a bit outdated. Old carpets, creaky floors, the kind of stuff you expect when you rent someone's house instead of staying at a hotel. Still, it had everything we needed. 3 bedrooms, decent location, and most importantly, air conditioning. We were going to be there for nearly 2 weeks, and with how hot it was, we needed that aircon running. We checked in late on a Sunday evening. The house was nothing special, but it was clean enough. A little dated, sure, but we weren't there to admire the decor. We settled in, unpacked, and adjusted the thermostat. It was a bit warm inside, so we turned the air down to a comfortable level and called it a night. The next day, we all went to work early. Long day, full of meetings, deadlines, all the usual chaos. When we got back, something felt off. The air conditioning was warmer than we'd set it. At first, we thought maybe it had an auto setting that adjusted on its own, but when we checked, someone had manually changed it. That didn't sit right with me. We were the only ones staying there. No cleaners were scheduled to come. No one had a key except the owner. It took a second for the realization to hit. The host had been inside the house while we were gone. We tried to shake it off. Maybe he had some system in place where he could control it remotely. But no, this was an old-school thermostat. The only way to change it was to physically be there. A couple of days later, the same thing happened. We came home, and the temperature had been changed again. This time, I checked the door locks, looking for any sign of tampering. Nothing obvious, but that uneasy feeling started to settle in. The next morning, one of my coworkers suggested we test it. Before we left, we took a tiny piece of tape and stuck it to the inside of the front door, high enough that no one would see it unless they were looking for it. If someone opened the door while we were gone, the tape would fall off. That day at work was long. I barely focused. The only thing I could think about was getting back to the house and checking the door. When we got back, I walked up first. The tape was on the floor. Someone had been inside. At this point, we were all on edge. We had no idea how often this guy was coming inside. Was it just the air conditioning? Or was he snooping through our things? That same evening, while we were sitting in the living room, someone knocked on the door. It was a real estate agent. They were there for a home viewing. Apparently, the house was up for sale, and people were scheduled to come walk through it. No one had told us this. No warning. No heads up. Just a random person showing up, expecting to walk through the place we were living in. We were so caught off guard that we just stood there, stunned. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few days, different people showed up at random times. Some with real estate agents, some just looking around on their own. We checked the listing again. Nowhere did it say the house was up for sale. We messaged the host, furious. No response. That's when we realized. The owner was coming inside whenever he wanted. Strangers were coming inside whenever they wanted. This was beyond unsafe. One afternoon, one of my coworkers came back to grab something during lunch. The host was inside the house. Not fixing anything. Not cleaning. Just standing in the hallway. When my coworker walked in, the guy acted like he wasn't doing anything wrong. Like it was totally normal for him to just let himself in while we were renting the place. That was it. We packed up that night and contacted Airbnb to file a complaint. The violations were clear: entering without permission, failing to disclose that the house was on the market, and having random strangers show up without telling us. Thankfully, Airbnb refunded us for the remainder of the stay, and we booked a hotel instead. I've stayed in dozens of Airbnbs over the years, and most of them have been fine. But this experience, it made me second-guess every single host from then on. Now, whenever I book a place, I check for hidden cameras. I make sure the locks actually work. I look up the address to see if it's listed for sale. I never leave valuables behind during the day, because some people don't understand boundaries. They don't give a damn about their guests' rights. I was looking for a quiet place to stay for the weekend, somewhere peaceful where I could get away from the city and just relax. I found an Airbnb cabin in upstate New York that seemed perfect. The pictures showed a small, cozy house surrounded by trees, with a big wooden porch and a fire pit outside. It looked like the kind of place where you could sit outside with a cup of coffee in the morning and listen to the birds. The listing had good reviews, and the host seemed nice. He sent me a message after I booked, letting me know he lived out of town but would be available by phone if I needed anything. That was fine with me. I liked the idea of having the place to myself. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful: tall trees, winding roads, little streams running along the highway. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was happy with what I saw. It looked just like the pictures. Small but well kept, with a stone path leading to the front door and big windows that let in a lot of light. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The key was under the doormat, just like the host said it would be. I let myself in and took a look around. The inside was simple but comfortable. A couch, a small dining table, a kitchen with a coffee maker, and a few basic appliances. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed with a thick comforter, and the bathroom was clean. The whole place had a warm, cabin-like feel to it. But then I noticed the basement door. It was in the hallway near the kitchen. A plain wooden door with a deadbolt on my side. That struck me as a little odd. Usually basement doors just have a regular handle, maybe a simple lock. But this one had a heavy-duty deadbolt, like the kind you'd put on an outside door. I wondered why. Maybe the host kept tools down there, or maybe there were plumbing pipes he didn't want guests messing with. Whatever the reason, I didn't think too much of it. I was here to relax, not worry about a basement. After unpacking, I made myself some food and watched a bit of TV. By the time the sun went down, I was already feeling tired from the long drive. I double-checked that the front door was locked, then went to the hallway and locked the basement door too, just out of habit. Before going to bed, I checked my phone one last time. No messages, no missed calls. Everything was fine. I fell asleep pretty quickly. The noise. At 2 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a sudden, jerking wake-up. It was more like my brain just slowly pulled me out of sleep because something felt off. I lay there in the dark, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, a dull thud. It sounded like it came from inside the house. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was pitch black except for a bit of moonlight coming through the window. I held my breath, listening harder. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then a faint creak, like wood shifting under pressure. It came from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to go out there, but I had to check. I slowly got out of bed, keeping the flashlight aimed toward the door. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved. When I stepped into the hallway, my stomach dropped. The basement door was unlocked. The deadbolt I had turned before bed was now open. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of it. Had I forgotten to lock it? No. I was sure I had. Had it somehow unlocked by itself? That didn't seem possible. I took a slow step forward and reached out to touch the door handle. It was cold. I pushed on the door just a little, but it didn't budge. Whatever was down there, the door was still closed. I took a deep breath and quickly turned the deadbolt again, locking it. Then, just to be safe, I grabbed a wooden chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the doorknob. I backed away slowly, flashlight still pointed at the door. I stood there for a few more seconds, listening. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to move. I walked back to my room, locking the bedroom door behind me. Then I lay in bed, wide awake, phone clutched in my hand. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every little noise made my skin crawl. The wind outside, the creak of the house settling, it all put me on edge. I kept my phone flashlight on for hours, just staring at the door, half expecting it to slowly open on its own. But nothing happened. At sunrise, I finally forced myself out of bed. I walked to the hallway, half expecting to see the chair moved or the lock undone again. But it was exactly how I left it. I stood there, staring at the basement door, trying to decide what to do. Did I want to open it? Did I want to see what was down there? No. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything inside, and left. I didn't even bother making coffee or breakfast. I just got in my car and drove away. As I pulled out onto the main road, my phone buzzed. A message from the Airbnb host. "Hey, hope you're enjoying your stay. Let me know if you need anything." I didn't reply. I left a neutral review, just something vague about the house being comfortable, but not quite what I expected. I didn't mention the basement. I didn't mention the lock. I just wanted to forget about it. Looking back, I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe the lock was faulty. Maybe the door settled weirdly in the frame, and that somehow caused the deadbolt to shift. Or maybe someone had been down there. Maybe they heard me lock the door and waited until I was asleep to quietly unlock it from the other side. I don't know, and I never want to. I had been traveling across the country for weeks, booking cheap Airbnbs along the way. Most places had been fine, some better than expected, some a little worse. Nothing special, just places to sleep before moving on to the next stop. This Airbnb was no different. I was passing through a small town in the Midwest and needed a place for the night. I found a listing that was cheap and had decent reviews. It was an old farmhouse, owned by a man who rented out a spare room. The pictures showed an old but well-maintained house with a big front porch and a quiet, empty road stretching out in front of it. It looked peaceful. The host's name was Gary. His profile said he was in his late 50s and had been renting out rooms for a few years. I didn't think much about it. I just needed a bed for the night. I booked the room, got the confirmation, and messaged Gary to let him know when I'd be arriving. He responded quickly, saying the front door would be unlocked, and I could just let myself in. I arrived late in the evening, just as the sun was setting. The farmhouse looked exactly like the pictures. White wooden walls, an old front porch, big empty fields on either side. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile down the road. I parked my car and grabbed my bag. The house was quiet. No lights on, no sign of Gary. I tried the front door. It was unlocked, just like he said. I stepped inside. The house smelled old, like dust, wood, and something faintly sour. The entryway opened into a small living room with a worn-out couch, a wooden coffee table, and a TV that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single lamp in the corner gave off a dim, yellow glow. To my right was the kitchen. It was small and cluttered, dirty dishes in the sink, an overflowing trash can, and a counter covered in random stuff. I saw old newspapers, a broken clock, and what looked like an empty bird cage. Weird, but not my problem. I just wanted to find my room and get some sleep. There was a hallway leading toward the back of the house. 3 doors, one at the end and 2 on the sides. The door on the left had a small sign taped to it that said guest room. That was mine. The door on the right was closed, with no sign or markings. And the door at the end of the hallway? Locked. I tried the handle out of curiosity, but it didn't budge. I figured it was either Gary's room or a storage closet. Either way, it wasn't my business. I stepped into my room and shut the door. The guest room was small and plain. A twin bed, a wooden dresser, a tiny window with a curtain too short to fully cover it. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo above the bed. I looked closer. It was a picture of the house, but older. The paint was fresher, the trees in front were shorter, and instead of an empty road, there was a dirt path leading into the woods. It felt strange, but again, not my problem. I set my bag down and sat on the bed. That's when I noticed something. The house was too quiet. I've stayed in plenty of houses alone before, but this was different. There was no distant hum of a fridge, no creaking of the old wood settling, no sounds from outside, not even crickets. Just complete, unnatural silence. Something about it made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone. No service. Great. I turned on the Wi-Fi. Luckily, it worked. I sent a quick message to a friend, letting them know where I was staying for the night, just in case. Then I locked my door, got under the covers, and closed my eyes. I told myself I was just overthinking things. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I didn't know why. The room was still dark. My phone showed 2:43 a.m. Then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from my room. It was coming from the hallway. Long, slow, dragging noises. It stopped. I held my breath. Then, a quiet tap on the wall. Just one, like someone was standing right outside my door. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The room lit up, but the noise had stopped. I sat up, listening. Nothing. Then a slow creak. The sound of a door opening. But not mine. The locked door at the end of the hallway. Who was in that room? I barely breathed. I didn't know what to do. I listened, trying to hear footsteps, but there was nothing. Just that awful silence again. I thought about leaving right then and there, but that meant stepping into the hallway, and I didn't want to see who, or what, had just come out of that room. I waited, gripping my phone. Minutes passed. No more sounds. I finally worked up the courage to get up. I moved slowly, trying not to make any noise. I crept toward my door, pressed my ear against it. Silence. I carefully unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack, peering out into the hallway. Dark. The only light was a faint glow coming from the living room. I stepped out, heart pounding, and moved quickly toward the front door. That's when I saw it. The locked door at the end of the hall. Wide open. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. It was pitch black inside. I couldn't see anything. And then, a shuffle, like someone stepping back into the shadows. I didn't wait. I ran to the front door, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the house. I ran to my car, hands shaking as I unlocked the door and jumped in. I slammed the locks down and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked back at the house, and the front door was open, just wide enough for someone to be standing behind it, watching. I didn't stay to find out. I sped down the empty road, not stopping until I was miles away. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and just sat there, trying to calm my breathing. My hands were still shaking. I checked my phone. No service. I connected to the gas station Wi-Fi and went straight to Airbnb. I sent a message to Gary, asking if he had been home that night. No response. I went to the listing. It was gone. Deleted. I never got an answer to what happened in that house. Who was in that room? Was it Gary? Someone else? Or had that room been empty for years, until I arrived? I don't know. I don't want to know. I left a vague review about unexpected issues with the stay, and got a refund from Airbnb. I haven't used Airbnb since. I had been on the road for over a week, driving across several states for work. By the time I reached a small town in Texas, I was exhausted. I just needed a quiet place to rest for a couple of nights before continuing my trip. Hotels in the area were either too expensive or fully booked, so I turned to Airbnb. After some searching, I found a cheap listing, a private guest house behind someone's home. The reviews were mixed. Some people said it was clean and quiet, while others complained about the host being a little strange. The price was too good to pass up, so I booked it. The host's name was Tom. His profile said he was in his 60s, had lived in the town his whole life, and loved meeting new people. I messaged him to confirm my check-in time. He responded almost immediately, saying he would be home and would love to show me around. Something about that message made me uneasy, but I ignored it. I was just staying 2 nights. How bad could it be? The house was in a quiet neighborhood, about 10 minutes from the main highway. It was old but well-maintained, a single-story home with a big yard and a separate guest house in the back. I pulled into the driveway. As soon as I parked, Tom stepped out of the house. He was older than I expected, probably in his late 60s or early 70s. He was thin, with gray hair combed neatly to the side and a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I got out of the car and gave a quick nod. Tom walked up immediately, standing too close as he greeted me. "Welcome, welcome," he said, smiling wide. His eyes never blinked. I forced a polite smile and grabbed my bag. "The guest house is just back here," he said, leading me toward the small building behind the main house. As we walked, I noticed something strange. All the windows on the main house were covered. Thick curtains drawn tightly shut. Not a single one open. I brushed it off. Some people like privacy. Tom unlocked the guest house door and stepped aside. "Go ahead, take a look around," he said. I stepped inside. It was small but decent, a single room with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. A TV sat on a wooden stand across from the bed, and an old armchair rested in the corner. The place was clean, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it. It was like the air itself was heavy, like I was being watched. Tom stood in the doorway, smiling. "You should be comfortable here," he said. "Let me know if you need anything." Then he paused. His eyes moved slowly across the room, as if checking something. Finally, he nodded to himself. "Well, I'll leave you to it," he said, stepping back outside. I closed the door and locked it. Something about him bothered me. I set my bag down and walked around the room. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat on the bed and pulled out my phone. I checked my messages, scrolled through social media, and tried to ignore the weird feeling. Then I noticed something. There was a tiny red light in the corner of the room. I looked up. The smoke detector. It wasn't blinking. It was just a steady red light. I frowned. I've stayed in a lot of Airbnbs, and smoke detectors don't usually have solid red lights. I stood up and walked over to it. Something about it seemed off. It was too big for a regular smoke detector. I reached up and twisted it. It came off too easily. Inside, where there should have been wires and sensors, there was a small black lens. A hidden camera. My stomach dropped. I turned around and scanned the room, heart pounding. How many more were there? I checked the TV, the armchair, the bathroom. I found 2 more cameras, one hidden in the vent above the bed and another inside the bedside lamp. I felt sick. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and my phone. I didn't care if I had paid for 2 nights. I was leaving. I swung the door open, ready to bolt to my car, and Tom was standing right outside. He was too close. His cold, dead eyes locked onto mine. "Everything okay?" he asked, tilting his head. I swallowed hard. I forced a stiff nod. "Yeah, just realized I have to leave early." His smile never faded. "You just got here." I forced a laugh. "Yeah, change of plans." His eyes flicked to the guest house behind me. For the first time, his smile twitched. A tiny break in his mask. He knew. He knew I had found the cameras. For a second, I thought he was going to block the doorway. But then he stepped back. "Well," he said, his voice flat. "That's too bad." I walked past him quickly, not turning my back. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the driveway. I drove for miles, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I pulled out my phone and went straight to Airbnb. I reported the hidden cameras. I wrote down every detail, where they were hidden, what they looked like, how Tom acted. Then I called the police. They sent an officer to meet me at the gas station. I told him everything. He took notes, asked a few questions, then said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not the first person to report that place." The officer told me they had gotten other complaints about Tom's Airbnb, but no one had ever pressed charges. They said they'd send someone to investigate. I never heard what happened after that. I checked Airbnb a week later, and the listing was gone. I still wonder how many people stayed in that guest house without realizing they were being watched. I wonder what Tom did with the footage. I don't know. I don't want to know. I just know one thing. I will never stay in an Airbnb again.